waiting on my doorstep when I got back from my shift at the warehouse. My last shift at the warehouse, to be precise. Without warning, my entire crew had been laid off. I had driven home in a numb haze, half thrilled that I might never see that soul-sucking place again, and half terrified about how I was going to pay next month's rent. I was so distracted that I almost walked right over top of the guy. "Benjamin Alexander Hearn?" he asked officiously. I told him that just Ben was fine. Nobody had called me Benjamin since high school detention. "My name is Osgood Mosby, of Mosby and Sons Solicitors," the man in the red tie went on. "I have an important message for you regarding the final testament of Jennifer Price. May we speak inside?" Jennifer Price? I hadn't thought about my mother in years. Apart from the photos that my father had shown me when I was a child, I had never actually seen her. And that was fine with me. As far as I was concerned, my father was my only real family. Jennifer Price was just some woman who had brought me into the world and then left me to fend for myself. To his credit, my father never blamed her for walking out on us. When I asked why she left, he would only shrug and say, "Oh, I'm sure she had her reasons." After a long day of work, he barely had the energy to heat up dinner and play with me for an hour or two before collapsing into bed. And as I got older, I came to understand that the questions that I was asking only caused him pain. If he was keeping any of my mother's secrets, he took them with him to the grave. I stared down at the manila envelope in the little bald lawyer's hands, wondering what it could possibly contain. An apology letter, the rights to some mostly empty bank accounts and a mountain of debt. It wasn't until I sat down across from Osgood Mosley that I realized what his visit really meant. My mother, my last living relative, had passed on. It was a lonely, hollow feeling, and I hadn't expected it to hit quite so hard. "Firstly, Benjamin, let me say that I'm sorry for your loss," Osgood Mosby began. "All these visits are never easy, but we've been entrusted with the execution of your mother's will." The lawyer paused. Something about the situation rubbed him the wrong way, but I couldn't tell what. "As you'll see here," he continued, "her assets are entirely tied up in Weeping Tree Books. Taking ownership of the store is therefore practically a requirement to inherit." I blinked. My mother had owned a bookstore. Stranger still was the address. It was less than a 15-minute drive away. I had always imagined my mother living with some swanky New York art dealer or belly dancing on some hippie commune out west, but apparently she had never left my hometown. Why had she never reached out to us? Part of me wanted to rip the packet and throw it in the trash, but another part was grimly curious to know what had made this bookstore so much more important than her own flesh and blood. Looking through the numbers gave me another reason to hesitate. While Weeping Tree Books wasn't going to make me rich by any means, it would be better than scrounging around for another warehouse job. Osgood waited patiently while I read, and then we signed some papers and he told me that he would be in touch. Something jangled in the bottom of the folder. "The bookstore keys," Osgood explained. "Ordinarily, I wouldn't leave them with you until everything is finalized, but this is hardly an ordinary situation. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon." With that, the lawyer stood, adjusted his tie, and left. As soon as I was sure that he was gone, I bolted to my car and sped across town to a place that I had never heard of. A little shop called Weeping Tree Books. The place wasn't easy to find. It was located in a maze of courtyard shops set back from the nearest street. If I hadn't been looking for it, I don't know how I would have even known that it was there. The other stores included an accounting firm, a nail salon, and a hole-in-the-wall Chinese restaurant. None of them seemed very busy, but I could see right away how the shop had gotten its name. There was a tall, gnarled willow tree in the center of the courtyard. I pressed my face against the window of the bookstore, but I couldn't make out anything in the dusty gloom. It felt like I was being watched. but the only living thing nearby was the enormous tree at my back. With a shiver, I turned the key in the lock. A dusty bell clanged over my head as I stepped inside. I don't know what I was expecting. With its yellowed ceiling and ugly gray and green carpet, the place felt like a gigantic filing cabinet. Narrow aisles took a surreptitious route toward the back of the store, which from where I was standing, I couldn't even see. Behind the display shelves was a wooden counter, an old-fashioned cash register, and a door labeled "Staff." My throat tightened. I felt my heartbeat accelerate. If my mother had left anything behind, that's where it would be. I was heading toward it when I heard a loud thump from the nearest aisle. A book had fallen from a shelf. It was so large and heavy that I couldn't imagine how it could have happened, unless it had been pushed. "Hello?" I called out. Of course, nobody answered. With the hair on the back of my neck standing up, I continued toward the staff room door. I found the key, pushed open it, and gasped. The room on the other side was a mini apartment, complete with a twin-sized bed, a miniature bathroom, and overhead storage. It reminded me of photos that I had seen of living quarters on submarines, rugged and almost cozy, in a claustrophobic sort of way. The bed was unmade, as though somebody, maybe even my mother, had been sleeping in it recently. A woman's clothes were in the cabinets, and there were other signs of life as well. Clothes, perfume, toothpaste. A tiny wrinkled photo was stuck in the corner of the mirror. It was a picture of a baby. Of me. The strangest thing was the total absence of technology. There was no laptop or alarm clock, not even a phone charger. I pulled my own phone from my pocket and discovered uneasily that, even though we were in the middle of town, I didn't have any service. The dusty bell above the main door clanged. A customer. Now I was going to have to explain to them who I was, what I was doing there, and why the shop was in fact still closed. I took a deep breath and turned around.
"You're not Jenny."
The wispy voice came from a young girl in an old-fashioned dress. The evening sun at her back made it impossible to see her face, but her irritation was clear and a little frightening. I felt like I was being accused of something. Miss Price isn't available right now. We're actually not even open for business, so..."
"Jenny said my order would be here. She promised."
The girl took a step toward me and extracted something from the apron of her dress. Something bladed and razor sharp that glinted in the dying rays of sunlight. She had a knife.
"I want my order."
The girl repeated, shaking with anger. I was about to yell something about how I would call the police if she didn't leave, but my cell wasn't working, and even the fragile-looking child in front of me could do a lot of damage to me or herself with that sharp edge before they got here. I put on my dumbest customer service face and asked if she knew where Jenny usually kept the orders.
"Beneath the counter, right there."
She pointed, as though I might be too stupid to see it. I bent down and found a shelf labeled "Reserved." There was only one book on it, a secondhand copy of some teen slasher novel from the 90s. I stood to hand it to her, only to discover that she was standing behind me.
"It's a good thing you had this,"
she whispered, as she slipped the book out of my hand. I shook my head. She was obviously going to tell me whether I wanted to hear it or not.
"I wouldn't have hurt you. No, nothing that easy. I would have just started to scream. And then, when somebody came running, I would have taken your hand, like this."
She gripped my wrist. Her fingers were small, cold, and hideously strong.
"And then I would have plunged this big old knife right into my throat."
The girl smiled up at me.
"Do you know what they do to child murderers in prison?"
Before I could answer, she slipped the massive blade back into the pocket of her apron, picked up the book, and left the store.
"When you see Jenny in hell, tell her that Esme says hi."
The girl shouted, and then let the door slam behind her. I waited a beat and then ran to alert the authorities. Or at least I tried to. Something odd happened when I reached the display shelves. The floor beneath my feet seemed to stretch somehow. No matter how hard I sprinted, I just couldn't advance. It was maddening and dizzying. I grabbed my knees woozily and then tried to jump forward instead. Nothing. I got the same result from walking backwards, climbing onto the display case or slithering across the carpet with my eyes shut. I wasn't sure which possibility was more horrifying, that I had lost my mind and all of this was in my head, or that I had somehow become a prisoner of Weeping Tree books. I was running out of things to try and it was getting dark. Another book had tumbled from the shelf, but I wasn't going to investigate. Now with the bookstore already so gloomy that I could barely see my hand in front of my face. I had an awful feeling that if I started down one of those aisles, I would turn around to find that the shelves had rearranged themselves and the way back to daylight had been closed off to me forever. With a tense look over my shoulder, I made my way to the door marked Staff. I closed it behind me and I lay down in the darkness to wait for morning. I dreamed of black, hairy hands holding me down and cracking open my chest as though it were a book. They peeled away my skin layer by layer, as though each one were a separate page. No matter how much it hurt, however, I just didn't have the strength to escape. My eyes snapped open. I had gotten tangled in the bedsheets. The stuffy little room was still pitch black, but more than just the nightmare had jolted me awake. Something was turning the handle of the door. Blinding light flooded into the room. I threw my hands up in front of my face and screamed. "Oh, forgive the intrusion," Osgood Mosley said and adjusted his tie. "Oh, when I didn't find you at home, I suspected where you might have gone. I suppose you've noticed that you're unable to leave." I thought back to the night before, to the ugly carpet extending beneath my feet, like some sort of horrible gray and green ocean. The memory made my empty stomach roll. I groaned and asked Osgood what the hell he was talking about. "Oh, you're the bookkeeper now. The store will not permit you to exit. Right now I suppose you're imagining yourself tunneling under the floor or breaking out through the ceiling. But whatever you're thinking, I assure you that another bookkeeper's already tried it and failed. The sooner you accept your fate, the better it will be for everyone involved." I didn't want to believe him, but his words carried the weight of a judge's life sentence. If what he was saying was true, all I had left in the world was what I had walked in with. My wallet and keys, a cell phone that didn't work, and a lighter that I still carried, even though I had quit smoking years ago. I clenched my hands into fists and demanded to know how he could have put me in this situation. Wasn't he supposed to be my mother's attorney? "Oh, I never said Jennifer Price was our client," Osgood huffed, sounding hurt. "I said that we've been charged with the execution of her will. In this case, we work at the behest of the Weeping Tree Books Trust Fund. We have a contract with the Chinese restaurant across the plaza. They'll provide you with 3 meals per day and whatever toiletries you need. If there are any other issues, you can inform me when I come by to empty the till each Friday." I fired off one angry question after another, but Osgood just held up his hand. "Oh, I'm really not at liberty to say anything more, although I do suggest that you avoid damaging or angering the store in any way. If you do," the lawyer chuckled, "the expanding carpet will be the least of your worries." I've never been a violent person. Even when things didn't go my way, I was usually able to keep my temper in check. But something about the smirk on that smug lawyer's face made me see red. As I lunged at him, he backed away until he had passed the display case. No matter how hard I swung my fist now, it wouldn't be enough to get at him. The dictionary that I chucked at his head fell at my feet as though I had simply dropped it. "Good luck, Benjamin." Osgood Mosley sighed and then walked out of the door. It was only after he was gone that I noticed the takeout bag on the counter. I had never eaten lukewarm Kung Pao chicken for breakfast before, but my hunger made it delicious. There was something comforting about the familiarity of the food. It reminded me that no matter how surreal my situation had become, I was still alive and kicking. I had shelter, sustenance, and my faculties intact. I didn't have to go down without a fight. The first order of business was to find the circuit breaker. It turned out to be right behind the door of the staff room. I could have even found it the night before if the shop hadn't been so dim. With the lights finally on, it was time to explore my new prison. By the time that I got to the end of the first aisle, I realized that little wasn't a word that could be applied here. The space was low-ceilinged and narrow, but another room full of shelves expanded to my right and to my left. A steep set of wooden stairs led to still more floors. The rational side of my mind knew that what I was seeing was impossible. There should have been apartments directly above and other stores on either side. But physics didn't seem to matter much inside of Weeping Tree Books. My foot banged against something as I walked. It was the book that had fallen from the shelf the night before. I picked it up and began to read. Benjamin Alexander Hearn didn't know what the little blue book contained, but seeing his own name in it made his stomach queasy. His eyes darted obsessively over the page, completely oblivious to the burning man standing behind him, eager to wrap his charred, bony fingers around his neck. I gasped and looked over my shoulder. The aisle was empty, but I could have sworn that I smelled charcoal in the air. When I glanced back down at the book, its pages were blank. Maybe, I thought queasily, they always had been. The bell above the door clanged, and I was grateful for an excuse to hurry back to the counter. The freckly, curly-haired guy in the doorway fiddled uneasily with the device in his hand while he waited. "Sign for this," he grunted, nudging the cardboard box in front of him with the toe of his boot. When I asked what was inside, he just shrugged. "Hey, don't ask me, man, I just deliver the packages." He squinted hard at me. "Hey, you're new, huh? The lady before was a lot nicer. She always had a pot of tea ready when I stopped by. I technically wasn't supposed to have any because I was on the clock and all, but..." He shrugged again. "She used to say that I reminded her of her son. And do you know what happened to her?" I felt the blood rush from my face. This was too much to handle all at once. I signed for the package, apologized for not having any drinks to offer, and I told him that I would see him next time. "I hope so," he said ominously, and then shouldered back out through the door. Almost reluctantly, I retrieved some scissors from below the counter and opened the box. It contained about 24 secondhand books. 2 were marked as special orders. I thought of Esme and her knife and shivered. The rest bore a note in some weird foreign language. As I looked away from the words, however, they seemed to come into focus. It was as though I could only read them from the corner of my eye. The message they carried was even stranger. "Stock before nightfall," it read. It appeared that I would be exploring the rest of the store sooner than I thought. I loaded the books onto the handcart beside the staff room and headed into the depths of the bookstore, making sure to take a different aisle than I had the first time. It was that quick decision, seemingly unimportant at the time, which ultimately saved my life. As I walked, I became aware of a thin red wire running along the floor. It bent and twisted with the bookshelves, turning at random, and I found myself following it. Since I didn't know where I was going, it didn't matter which route I took. What mattered was being able to find my way back. At first, I thought that Weeping Tree was laid out like a normal bookstore. There were sections for romance, science fiction, history. There was even a kids section. The further I went, however, the more obvious it became that my impression had been wrong. The signs above the aisles and nooks and reading areas became more bizarre. Cryptozoology, non-Euclidean geometry, alternate futures. Some of the labels were in other languages, pictures, and hieroglyphics. I wished I could stop and browse through some of them, but I was too busy looking for a section where the delivery books might fit. They all seemed to be old biographies of saints, although not from any religion that I'd ever heard of. Sweat ran down my back, my hands were numb from hauling the handcart, and the lights overhead had started to feel like the sun of some sweltering desert. Most disturbing of all, I was no longer sure exactly how long I had been walking. It felt like hours, but it could have been more. The only thing that I was certain of was the red cable I was following along the floor. At some point, I heard a bang from inside the box. I hadn't hit any bumps, yet a book called The Agony of Saint Honora had toppled over. As I put it back in place, it shuddered eagerly in my hand. Stocked before nightfall, the note had said. I wondered what time it was. I picked up my pace, barely pausing to inspect the signs above the sections that I passed. Aruspice, eschatology. I sniffled. That weird, charred smell was back. There was a sort of haze in the air too, as though the shelves were filling with smoke. The Burning Man. The thought crossed my mind seconds before I saw him, a black shade wreathed in fire. Although the flames around him burned white hot, the carpet beneath his feet wasn't even singed, as though this was a special fire meant only for him. A low groaning sound came from his ribcage. It was a noise that bones might make if they could scream. The Burning Man's back was to me, and I prayed that the wheels of the handcart wouldn't squeak as I snuck past his aisle. I rounded a corner and felt the air clear. I had made it, this time. Another angry bang came from inside of the box, reminding me of what I was doing in the depths of the bookstore. A few minutes later, I finally found a section that I thought might fit. Esoteric hagiography. Wasn't that the study of saints? Better yet, the shelves were only about 2/3 full. There was more than enough room to do what I needed to and get back to the front desk before what? The cover of The Agony of Saint Honora lifted slightly, as though something was bashing against it from below. A wail came from within, one that reminded me of a woman crying in pain. I scrambled to cram it onto the shelf, and as I slid it into place, I felt someone's cold fingers slip out from between the pages and brush against my own. With a sinking feeling in my gut, I turned back to the box. A large tome bound in what I hoped was leather had flung itself free and it was rattling on the floor. Inside of a small white lace booklet, a chant was growing louder and louder. There were other warning signs too, but none of them seemed nearly as urgent as that unholy chorus. It sounded like it was coming from inside of my own skull, and it didn't stop until I put it into place on the shelf. And behind me, the skin-bound tome flipped open. A raw-headed, crimson thing rose out of it, as though climbing from a well. The blood-soaked monk's robes that it wore left no stain on the pages, but when its empty eye sockets met mine, I knew that it was no hallucination. "Sinner," it hissed, pointing a skinless finger directly at me. Other books were struggling to open themselves as well, but there was no time for that now. I had to get away while I still could. I glanced over my shoulder and was horrified to see that where there had been an open aisle behind me, there was now only a sealed wall of bookcases. The flayed monk got down on all fours like an animal, twisted his head around backwards and skittered towards me. I dived out of the way and crawled frantically toward the book that he had come from. As he charged for a second time, I slammed it shut and watched him disappear into thin air. As I slammed his book into place on the shelf, I read its title, The Flaying of Saint Valak. I shelved the rest of the books, beginning with the most active ones, and by the time that it was done, I was panting from the effort. Who the hell would buy one of these awful things? I wondered, and what might they use it for? The clang of the shop's bell reminded me that I would probably find out soon enough. It also reminded me that I was lost in the depths of the store, so lost that it seemed strange to me that I could hear the bell at all. And then I remembered the red cable. It was there all right, even if it wasn't where I had remembered. The path back to the entrance led through an entirely different set of shelves, and along the way, I saw something that chilled me to the core. At the end of one of the aisles, a man hung by a belt from the rafters. He was skeletally thin and pale. It seemed that the rope had just finished what starvation had already begun. The flesh on his fingers had been chewed off, and although I couldn't have said for sure, it seemed like he had done it himself. The second, I took a step toward the poor man's cadaver, and then I realized what recovering it would mean. I would have to leave the safe zone marked by the red cable and cross 4 more corridors. When I turned back around, would I find only another wall of bookcases? Would I wind up wandering helplessly for weeks or even longer, literally eating myself just to keep the hunger at bay? I turned away from the grisly sight and hurried toward the front desk. Even though it felt like I had walked for hours to reach this section, I arrived at the front of the store in less than 2 minutes. The man at the counter cleared his throat. I looked him over nervously. Goatee, piercings, long-length black trench coat. I asked how I could help him. "I need a cookbook," he whispered. When he saw the look on my face, he blushed and added, "My girlfriend says if I don't start pulling my weight around the house, she's gonna kick me out. I'm fine with anything so long as the recipes are easy." It occurred to me that even a shop like this from time to time would be visited by regular folks. I was about to warn him to be careful not to get lost, but the store behind me seemed to have shrunk somehow. The oddly named sections had vanished, and the culinary nook was plain to see. I pointed to it and watched him shuffle away sheepishly. A few minutes later, the bell clanged again. A stocky gray-haired woman in a puffy pink sweater walked through the door. Unlike the young man in the cooking section, she didn't say hello or acknowledge me at all. She just stared from behind her thick, tortoiseshell glasses. Her glare continued even as she waddled past the front desk. Her neck twisted in a way that shouldn't have been possible, not even for a contortionist. I gulped. This was no ordinary customer. Trying to act casual, I slipped out from behind the desk and I walked into the stacks, pretending to be searching for something. As soon as I was out of the woman's line of sight, I planned to tell the young guy in the trench coat something. I still wasn't sure what, to get him out of harm's way. I was rounding the corner of the second set of bookcases when the woman walked out in front of me. She was breathing excitedly through her mouth, which suddenly seemed much wider than it had been a moment ago. Her head moved toward me even though her body hadn't budged. She ran her tongue over wormy violet lips. On the other side, I could see several rows of tiny razor-sharp teeth. Even without words, I understood her warning. Stay put. Don't interfere. As I backed away, I whistled, coughed, and even knocked over a display stand. But none of it was enough to make the young man turn around. I didn't see what happened next, but I heard it. The gasp, the scream choked in blood, the gruesome sound of feasting. The noise reminded me of a pack of hyenas ripping apart a corpse. I stayed frozen behind the front desk until the woman passed by for a second time. Beneath her fluffy pink sweater, her stomach was hideously distended, as though she had just eaten something even larger than she was. She bought a pair of romance novels and a thick purple encyclopedia called Mind-Altering Toxins of the Great Lakes Region. There was still a few flecks of red on her cheeks. I glanced back down the aisles behind her. They extended into the distant darkness once again. The store, it seemed, could rearrange itself based on the customers inside of it. I wondered what else it was capable of. Was it sentient? Or was it just reacting to these stimulus around it, the way that plants in shade incline toward the sunlight? Did my mother also have to learn all of this the hard way, back when she was the bookkeeper? My experiences so far left one thing crystal clear. The store couldn't or wouldn't protect me. I was disposable, just like my mother, the hanging man, and all the other bookkeepers before us. The pork fried rice and oolong teas sitting on the counter had gone cold, but I wolfed them down anyway. As I ate, I thought about the red cable. Someone had found a safe path through the store and put it there, which meant that the previous bookkeepers might have other information to pass down. Information which could help me stay alive inside of this nightmare. The idea hit me with the force of a religious revelation. I shoved aside my food and started turning the staff room upside down. I checked beneath drawers, in the pages of magazines, behind the toilet and inside the lampshade, but I found nothing. And then I looked at the mirror, at my own baby picture still tucked snugly in the corner. If my mother had left anything else important behind, it might be connected to the mirror as well. I lifted it gently from the wall. A thin red journal was taped to the back of it. The first page was blank. The second began with a chilling greeting. "Hello, stranger. My name is Eugene Dodd," it began. "And if you're reading this, then I'm already dead. I know I can't make you believe any of what I've written because for all you know, this journal is just another one of the bookstore's little tricks. Not sure what I mean? You must be new here. Until this place caught me on the night of December 17th, 1948. I was a club drummer with a 2-pack habit and a criminal record for theft, which kept me from getting a straight job. I used to walk past Weeping Tree Books every morning on my way back from gigs, and there was always this pretty brunette sitting on a stool behind the front desk. One morning when I was still drunk from the night before, I decided that I ought to go inside and talk to her. We hit it off right away, and pretty soon we were sharing coffee, donuts, and kisses behind the counter every morning. She was lonely, she said. She had an abuser in her life, one who wouldn't let her go, and she wanted my help. She asked me to bring her a pistol so that she could finally be free. By that point, I would have done anything to help her, so I reached out to some of my contacts and got her what she wanted. You should have seen the smile on her face when I walked in the door that snowy December morning, opened up my coat and showed her the .38. She ran up to me, kissed me deep, and took it out of my hand. Then she told me she was sorry and she used it on herself. I was in shock. Even though there was no way anybody could survive a wound like that, I still tried to go find help, but I couldn't get any closer to the door. When I turned around again, the store had absorbed all that was left of the girl I loved. Even the bullet hole in the wall had disappeared like it was never there. At noon, a guy from the deli around the corner dropped off some sandwiches, collected the trash, and left without a word. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Here's what I've learned in the past few months. Maybe it'll be useful to you. Then again, maybe not. Weeping Tree Books has been around since 1862 at least, but its history probably goes back a lot further than that. I only know that date because of a rolled up newspaper in the pocket of a skeleton that I found. The dead man's clothes were right for the time period, and while I don't know what killed him, something took the time to pluck the teeth out of his skull. The store moves around a lot. I found junk in here from Baton Rouge, London, Hong Kong, and Montreal, just to name a few. Somebody in power is aware of the place's existence, because every now and again 2 government types in black suits come by to scope it out. They never come inside though. They probably know better. Which brings me to the customers. You'll get some average folks here and there, but the majority come to Weeping Tree Books because what's available here can't be found anywhere else. Some of them won't notice your presence at all, and most will ignore you out of respect for the bookstore. And then there are the others, the ones who will want to drink your blood or lay their eggs in your throat, the ones who will want to dissect your thoughts and feed on your fear. For them, you're just a special treat on the way to whatever twisted knowledge they came here to find. I've been lucky so far, but that's the thing about luck, right? Sooner or later, it always runs out. I've been here for over 13 years now, and I can feel myself starting to slow down. I may not be able to get out of this place, but maybe I can take it to hell with me. I asked Mickey over at the deli to bring me a couple of gas cans and a box of matches. All I need now is a spark. And so, stranger, I guess this is goodbye. Maybe these words will go up in smoke along with the rest of this god-awful place. But if they don't and you stumble on this little journal a couple of decades down the line, don't say I didn't warn you. That was the end of Eugene's handwriting. I thought I finally had an idea about who the Burning Man might have been. Another bookkeeper had picked up where he had left off, and another after that, but there was no time to flip through them now. The dusty bell above the door was ringing. And so it went. There were days when I had no customers, and there were days when the demands of being the bookkeeper left me aching and exhausted. For every ordinary customer, there were a dozen who were more or less than entirely human. Their requests sent me scurrying to the depths of the bookstore, places where the shelves stretched too high to see or where the stairs spiraled down into a cold, damp darkness that seemed to have no bottom. I got to know John, the long-haired teenager who had brought me my meals from the restaurant across the square. He seemed to understand my situation and offered to cook my meals rather than just bringing me leftovers. After trying his attempts at French toast and spaghetti, however, I decided to stick to the menu. In my free time, I read everything that I could get my hands on, but especially the journal that I had discovered behind the mirror. Within its pages, I found a list of the most dangerous customers, along with their physical descriptions and suggestions for how to survive their visits. The squat, gray-haired woman made an appearance beside the line. Let her do as she pleases if you want to live. Next came the notes of a bookkeeper named Anna, who had marked the safest route through the store with a red cable. Apparently, she had also set up a blue cable that ran vertically, and a yellow one whose purpose I couldn't guess. Anna's section of the journal ended abruptly with the phrase, "Tomorrow I'll take my stable gun and follow the yellow line all the way to..." The pages beyond had all been ripped out. I had hoped to find something written by my mother among the other bookkeeper's scribblings, but there was no such luck. I checked the back of the baby picture pressed into the corner of the mirror, but there I found only a single mysterious phrase. I've hidden it in the puzzle book section. No matter what happens, Pigface can't be allowed to have it. I had never seen any sort of puzzle section in the bookstore, and I had no idea who Pigface was. But whatever my mother had written was so important to her that she had used the entire back of the photograph to send her message. And then during my second week at Weeping Tree Books, a customer arrived who would change my life forever. He came in an hour after lunch, and as he walked through the doorway, he smothered the sound of the bell with an enormous hand. Despite his immense size, he moved silently. If I hadn't happened to look toward the front of the store in that precise moment, he could have easily snuck up behind me. He had the kind of bulky, overgrown build that I associated with steroids, but his tanned skin and weather-beaten clothes gave him the appearance of someone who lived on the streets. Weirdest of all was his mask, a pink rubber pig's head that stuck out from beneath his hood. Pigface, I thought, and shuddered. "I'm looking for some stolen property," the huge man rumbled. "It's in here somewhere. I can smell it." When I asked him what title he was searching for, he chuckled. It was like a mountain laughing. There isn't any title, but I'll know it when I see it. I started to tell him that he was free to browse for as long as he liked, but that only got another rumbling giggle. Oh no, Pigface insisted. You're coming with me. He put a hand on my shoulder and pinched. It felt like my arm was about to pop out of its socket. I clenched my teeth to avoid crying out, but it was clear that running away wasn't an option. Pigface, half guided, half pushed me forward into the stacks. I noticed nervously that we weren't taking the safe route, but before I could mention it, we had made another turn and the red cable had disappeared completely. I wondered aloud whether the big man knew what section his stolen property might be in. Just keep walking. He grunted and nudged me toward a downward spiraling staircase that I had never seen before. The list of dangerous customers in the journal hadn't mentioned anyone who looked like this, but that didn't mean much. Whoever had compiled it had only been the bookkeeper for a few months, and the note about Pigface came afterwards. Each sub-basement we passed was disorientingly similar to the first floor. I kept an eye out for Anna's blue cable, but there was no sign of it. Whoever the big stranger was, he seemed to know exactly what he wanted and where he was going. There, Pigface rumbled, pointing to the top shelf of a section marked puzzle books. I was so unnerved by how deep we had gone, and by the fact that I couldn't find my way back, that it took me a moment to react. Pigface gestured irritably to the ladder beside the shelf. I figured he was too heavy to climb up it himself. As reluctant as I was to turn my back on him, I put my boot on the base of the ladder and went to retrieve his stolen property. The top shelf was higher than it had looked from below, and the stranger's large size distorted the dizzying view downward. The ladder wobbled uneasily as I grabbed the book that Pigface was pointing to. It was a beautifully embossed volume that looked like it could have been a collection of fairy tales, and I couldn't resist taking a quick peek inside. I pretended to lose my balance and let the book fall open on the rung in front of me. The page I had flipped to showed a photo of some kind of stone pit, one that had been sealed with rusty bars. It looked real enough to touch. And then a pair of hands reached up from the darkness inside. A young boy pressed his face against the bars, mouthing the word "help." I gasped and turned the page, only to find another pit holding another child. I thought of all the stories I had heard about witches and ogres with big burlap bags who came to drag away the bad kids. If there was any truth to them, it wasn't a stretch to imagine that such a creature might be storing his victims inside of an enchanted book. The ladder trembled. Pigface had grabbed it, and now he was jabbing his finger up at me, ordering me to throw him the book right now. I shook my head and told him that I would be down in a minute. Pigface kicked the ladder. I hugged the rungs with one hand and clutched the book against my chest with the other. It was my only bargaining chip. Once the big man got it, he could do whatever he wanted with me. If I was lucky, I might end up in one of those cells between those beautifully etched pages. I threw myself against the nearest shelf. Its ledge was barely wide enough to support my sweaty fingers. There's nowhere to run. If you come down now, I promise that I'll make it quick. I looked left, right, and then at the perilous drop below. Pigface was right, but I wasn't going to admit it. I scooted along the ledge while he followed down below, waiting for me to give in to the inevitable. He was too big to climb up after me, but I figured it was only a matter of time before he decided to knock over whatever shelf I was clinging to. And what would happen then? I scrambled diagonally and down, making sure to stay beyond the reach of these strangers' freakishly long arms. My eyes darted up to the single incandescent light bulb illuminating this particular nook of the bookstore, and it gave me an idea. I flung the first hardcover I grabbed at the bulb, and when it shattered, I leapt to the floor in darkness. A shower of other books tumbled down behind me, but I didn't hear any sounds of pursuit. as I crawled around the corner and got to my feet. I couldn't even hear the big man's breathing. Where had he gone? A hand clamped down on my face. Bet you didn't know that I can see in the dark. Pigface tightened his grip on my face a little, but the pressure was enough to make me scream. His free hand closed around his property and all of the captives within. I sniffed. Shortly after the bulb had shattered, I had become aware of a faint smoky smell wafting through the aisles. I spotted a faint orange flicker. The Burning Man. "Eugene!" I shouted. "Help!" Through a gap in the books, I saw the fiery corpse pause. And then everything seemed to happen at once. Eugene's flame-wreathed spirit careened toward us, crashing into Pigface like a fireball. He let go of me and tumbled backward, howling with rage and pain. I ran without looking back. I could hear the shelves reorganizing themselves, trapping the big man in its depths. The store wasn't protecting me, I realized. It was punishing Pigface for his disrespect. I spotted a staircase to my right, but I didn't dare to take it, not without knowing where I was first. The sounds of Pigface's struggling grew fainter. I slowed down and concentrated my energy on searching for the blue cable, the one that Anna claimed she had used to navigate between levels of the bookstore. 4 staircases later, and I finally found it. I followed it to its meeting point with the red cable, and then back to the front desk of Weeping Tree Books. I slammed the big man's volume onto the counter and opened it, this time from the beginning. That charred smell made me look up before I had even begun. Eugene stood at the far end of the aisle holding something in his hand. He flung it toward me and then walked back into the stacks, leaving behind only a smoky haze and a flickering orange glow. After he had gone, I approached and retrieved it. It was a key. Its tip was black as though dyed by ink, and the sight gave me a mad, impossible idea. And then again, these photos of caged pits, these children trapped between the pages of a book. Wasn't that just as crazy? Maybe an insane problem demanded an insane solution. Working fast, I flipped to the first picture that showed one of those awful prisons. A padlock was clearly visible beside the bars. I lowered the key toward it and felt it sink into the page. I twisted it in the lock and then did the same for each cage on the following pages. I was rewarded by the sight of scampering feet and grinning faces. The children were finally breaking free. At any moment, I expected to see Pigface emerge from the depths of the store, covered with hideous burn wounds and roaring for vengeance, but the bookshop stayed silent. It had swallowed him, just like it had swallowed so many others. I knew that I might never learn the truth about how my mother was ensnared by Weeping Tree Books, or what happened to her afterwards, but after so many years of bitterness, I finally felt at peace with her memory. I had fulfilled her last request, one that she had entrusted me to find in spite of the nightmarish circumstances. In a few hours, John will come by with some egg rolls and shrimp fried rice. I'll read a few more chapters of The Long Goodbye, and then crawl into bed before it gets dark. I've learned the hard way not to wander around the store at night. Tomorrow, I'll begin my search for Anna's yellow cable and the missing pages of Eugene's journal. There's no guarantee that it will lead to an escape from Weeping Tree Books, but I've got all the time in the world to find out. This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. You ever notice how financial stress doesn't just stay about money? It kind of bleeds into everything. Your mood, your sleep, your relationships. I've definitely had moments where I felt completely overwhelmed just trying to figure things out. Like no matter what I did, I was always a step behind. And I think a lot of people feel that way. The thing is, struggling with money doesn't mean that you failed. Sometimes it just means you're dealing with a lot, and you haven't had the right support yet. That's where therapy can actually help. Not by giving you financial advice, but by helping you manage the stress and anxiety that could come with it. It can help you understand your relationship with money, build healthier habits mentally, and just feel a little less alone with it. BetterHelp makes it easier to get started. They'll match you with a licensed therapist based on a short questionnaire, and if it's not a right fit, you can switch anytime. With over 30,000 therapists and millions of people using it, it's a way to connect with someone who can help you work through what's weighing on you. When life feels overwhelming, therapy can help. Sign up and get 10% off at betterhelp.com/MrCraves. That's better, HELP.com/MrCraves. Whenever a new client walks into Weeping Tree Books, I've learned to just smile. Ignoring people can be seen as a dangerous lack of respect, but drawing attention to yourself by talking can be even more deadly. A nice quiet smile is the best middle ground. Most of the time, the customers even smile back, although some of them might just be showing off their extra teeth. Occasionally, people come in for a gift or something to read on vacation. Others are just curious about the little courtyard bookshop with a willow tree out front. I do my best to watch out for those ordinary folks while they're here. If the shelves start to rearrange themselves or the signs above the aisles turn strange, I gently call their attention in the opposite direction. Most of the time, I just make something up. Did you know about the special 30% off sale? Are you a member of our exclusive book club? Weeping Tree Books doesn't need to sell a single volume to stay in operation, and it certainly doesn't offer any memberships, but the minor annoyance is usually enough to get people oriented away from danger. Then there are the other customers, the ones with a sheen of cold sweat who look like they haven't slept in weeks. The ones who appear normal until I look at them out of the corner of my eye and see something that belongs in a child's nightmare. Those clients always seem to know exactly what they're looking for. I've been the bookkeeper at Weeping Tree Books for over 3 months now, and in all that time, I've never once set foot out the door. The lawyer who got me into this mess warned me that every attempt I made to escape would fail. And he was right. My predecessor, Anna, ran color-coded cables along the floor of the bookstore to show which paths were safe. I had hoped that one of them, the yellow one, would show a path out. As I followed it, however, I noticed something disturbing. The ceiling seemed to be getting lower as I went. The aisles grew narrower, and even the books themselves were smaller. When I banged my head against a light fixture, I couldn't deny it any longer. I was being led into some sort of tunnel. 20 minutes later, I was crawling on my knees. The volumes lining the shelves around me were as small as post-it notes. I was slithering on my belly when the corridor finally opened up into a larger room. And that's where I found the bodies. 1 woman and 2 children. Their clothing was from another era, but their wounds were so fresh that they might have been butchered only moments before. The cuts had been made by a small blade and maybe a pocket knife, and I could still see the shock and fear in the poor boy's wide, glassy blue eyes. The woman was clutching something in her hand, a heart-shaped locket that held black and white photos of herself and another man. EKS read the initials beneath her name. ALM read his. Whoever ALM was, his body was nowhere to be found in the gruesome menagerie around me. Meanwhile, the aisle up ahead was even tighter, and unlit by a single light bulb. As I approached, I would have sworn that I felt a warm, moist wind, like someone's breath blowing out of it. I wasn't going to follow the yellow cable a single step further. Even if freedom was on the other side, I knew that there was no way I could force myself to move ahead into that narrow, suffocating, hungry darkness. Since then, I've accepted my fate. I told myself that I get 3 warm meals a day and a place to sleep, and that there are plenty of people who do worse work for a lot less. I could have gone on believing that forever, if it hadn't been for a girl named Amy. I met her a few days after Thanksgiving. It was a slow afternoon with no deliveries to stock and a cold rainstorm battering down in the courtyard outside. Even the willow tree looked miserable. I would have been almost grateful to be trapped inside the warm and dry bookstore if my dinner hadn't been taking so long to arrive. John Wei, the teenage fry cook at the Chinese restaurant across the plaza, was the one who had provided my meals. He was usually so on time and prepared that I'd never even considered what might happen if one day he just didn't show up. Since I was unable to leave Weeping Tree Bucks, I had no other way to feed myself and no guaranteed visitors apart from the lawyer who came by each Friday to collect the week's profits. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder at the stacks, something that I usually tried not to do, especially if I felt like I was being watched. But hunger and nervousness had altered my routines. The safest part of Weeping Tree Books was where I sat, right between the front desk and the staff room where I slept. Yet I found myself pacing the aisles, flipping irritably through one cheesy romance novel after another. Where the hell was John? Someone cleared the throat behind me. Startled at first, I relaxed when I turned all the way around. There he was, a slicked back black hair, a mischievous smile, and a steaming plastic bag of Chinese takeout in his hand. Finally, I sighed. I was starting to get worried. The words died in my throat as I realized that I hadn't heard the dusty bell above the front door ring as John walked in. Whatever was standing in front of me held out the bag of food and smiled even wider. It hadn't blinked once. I backed away slowly and it matched my speed. I turned to run and it opened its mouth wide. And the dusty bell above the bookshop door clanged. I blinked. There was no uncanny duplicate of John Wei lurching toward me, opening its mouth constrictor wide to swallow me whole. Either I had imagined the whole thing or whoever had walked into the store had just saved my life. Ben? A tense female voice called out. This is for you. John's sick. He asked me to bring your dinner over. With her red nose and puffy eyes, the girl standing at the front desk wasn't exactly a picture of health herself. She set a bag of food down on the counter, stepped back a good distance, and sneezed into her scarf. Now that I was over my shock, it was clear that I was looking at a slimmer, more feminine version of John. I'm Amy, the girl explained. John's older sister. I nodded, completely forgetting to say thank you. It took me a moment to realize that Amy hadn't waved goodbye and left. She was still watching me curiously, hands stuffed into her pockets while she rocked on her heels. So, long shift, huh? She commented, looking at the empty bookstore and the ticking clock above the staff room door. The longest, I grinned. Sometimes it feels like it'll never end. I fumbled for something to say and then added, I didn't know John had a sister. That got a laugh. Oh, we might look alike, but we don't exactly get along, and besides, I was away at college until recently. Amy blushed, suddenly looking like she would have preferred to be almost anywhere else. Well, see you around, I guess. I spiced up your dinner a bit. I hope you like it. With a final sneeze into her scarf, Amy hurried back out into the rain. I wasn't sure what she had done to my chicken, but it was the best thing that I had eaten in weeks. As I stared into the darkness of the staff room that night, I found myself hoping that it would take John a while to recover. The next day dawned less rainy but just as gloomy. I was disappointed to find that Amy had left my breakfast on the doorstep earlier that morning. I told myself that she must have woken up early to get a head start on her college work. It was better than the possibility that she was avoiding me. Around 11, a large shipment of botany guides arrived and had to be stocked, which meant that I had missed Amy's lunchtime visit too. Then in the afternoon, a customer had arrived who drove John's sister from my mind completely. He was bald and well-built, wearing a brown leather coat and jeans that looked like he had just bought them off the rack. He gave me a brief nod when he came through the door, and he headed directly to the depths of the shop. And that set off my alarm bells immediately. If there was one thing that I was sure of, it was that the further one ventured from the front desk, the stronger the strangeness became. I hurried after the guy to warn him, only to find that he had disappeared. Unlike most of the other ordinary clients, the guy seemed to know the layout of the place already. But when he still hadn't reappeared after 2 hours, I started to get worried. It was a relief when I finally heard his quick steps coming down the aisle, but I did wonder what he had been up to for so long back there. "Find what you were looking for?" I asked. Not today," the guy shrugged, and then left without another look back. Not today. It was an odd comment, most of all because it implied that he would be back. Weeping Tree Books rarely had repeat clients, although whether that was due to amnesia of the shop or just due to the fact that there wasn't much in stock for regular humans, I couldn't have said. Half an hour after the man in the leather jacket left, there was another odd occurrence, one that might have meant everything or nothing. A 20-something redhead in a black overcoat entered the plaza, walked around it in a slow, deliberate circle, and then left. He might have been lost, but he wasn't following the navigation on any phone, nor did he ask anybody in the nail salon next door for directions. I couldn't shake the feeling that his weird behavior and the man in the brown jacket were related, but I had no idea how. I was still mulling it over when Amy arrived with my dinner. Once again, she hesitated before walking out the door. Sorry I left in such a hurry yesterday. It's just when we started talking about school." Amy took a deep breath. The truth is that I quit. The work, the pressure, it was just too much. Everyone is kind and sympathetic in telling me to take my time, but I can tell they're disappointed. My parents, they had so much invested in me, you know. And now... Hey, at least you're not stuck working in a bookstore for the rest of your life, I offered. I guess it's true. There are always worse places you could be. Amy perked up. Have you got any recommendations? How could I tell her that the last book I had flipped through was over a century old, written in symbols rather than letters, and appeared to be about how to manipulate the weather? And before that, I tried to find some relaxing images of nature and a photo guide for the modern hunter. Only the first picture, however, had been taken in the woods. It showed a small house at twilight with the lights on. The photos that followed were just more shots of the same house, closer and closer each time. I quit when the photographer seemed to crawl through the kitchen window. And then there was a little volume called Your Erotic Journey. And the short stories it contained were always uncannily similar to whatever the reader was fantasizing about at the time, which would have been great if it wasn't for the dreams. They were lush, vivid, and followed the stories exactly, apart from their gruesome endings. For weeks afterwards, I woke up shivering, my head full of beautiful faces, with ink-black eyes and the lingering sensation of my limbs severed one by one while I was still alive. Nope, I replied to Amy's question. Nothing comes to mind. It was the beginning of our friendship. From that day forward, Amy stayed and chatted for a while whenever she dropped off my meals. I wasn't sure what she saw in me, but I was grateful for the company. Maybe I thought she just needed somebody outside of her family to talk to. When my mother Jennifer was a bookkeeper, she had kept a hot plate and a kettle of tea for visitors. I tried to live up to her tradition, but apart from the occasional friendly delivery driver, I hardly ever had any visitors. Amy's presence made that December a happy and hopeful time for me, or at least as happy and hopeful as any time can be in a place like Weeping Tree Books. Knowing that we would see each other again made my daily grind more bearable, but all that daydreaming also distracted me, making me overlook things whose importance I wouldn't understand until it was already too late. The man in the brown jacket returned often, and each visit was longer than the last. After he gave me the slip for a second time, however, I gave up on trying to follow him or discover what he was doing. There was something familiar, too, about the young red-headed guy who would stop to stare into the display window for a few minutes, but I barely noticed him. I had more bigger things to think about, and the most urgent was, how was I going to tell her? It was clear from the way that Amy snuggled close to me while we talked and brushed her fingers against mine that we were becoming more than friends. What would happen if she wanted to go see a movie together or take a walk in the park? If I had told her the truth, she would think that I was insane. If I stalled, she would eventually get tired of waiting and move on. The turning point came on Christmas Eve. Amy had brought over a string of colored lights and asked if she could put them up in the bookshop window to make the place more festive. I agreed, and not wanting to admit that I was unable to walk past the display shelf to help. She was still working when the man in the brown jacket strode out of the door, as businesslike as ever. Suddenly, Amy paused. "What is it?" "I think I know that guy," she muttered. "From my PhD program." "No, it can't be. Jacob wouldn't be caught dead in a leather jacket." Until that moment, I hadn't realized that Amy had been just as elusive about her time at college as I was about my work at the bookstore. What had she studied? Why had she quit? That night, when she came back with a 3-course meal and a bottle of wine to share in the glow of the festive lights, those questions were the last thing on my mind. Amy wound up spending the night with me. I made up all sorts of excuses to justify why I was allowing her to stay without warning her about the bookstore's dangers, but the simple and selfish truth was that I wanted her more than I cared about the potential consequences. We drifted off to sleep in each other's arms and woke to the sound of crying outside the door. "What's that noise?" Amy mumbled groggily, and then sat up and felt around for her clothes in the dark. "It sounds like some kid is hurt." Of course. I was used to the nocturnal noises of the bookstore. Grumbles, shouts, and distant conversations. The haunting, distant songs of a choir. The rowdy chaos of a party. Sometimes I thought that I recognized the voices, but more often they just sounded like incoherent gibberish. There were metallic groans and reverberating clangs, as though the store itself was stretching out after a long day. But this screeching infant was something new, and just like Amy had said, it sounded like an abandoned child. The staff room was pitch dark, and I didn't realize what Amy was doing until I heard her zip up her sweater. "Hey, where are you going?" I whispered. "There's a kid in trouble out there," she grunted. "We've got to do something." I tried to argue that the noise was coming from the apartments up above, and that she couldn't possibly be hearing what she thought she was hearing inside of a closed-down bookstore. But Amy refused to listen. "When John was little, I went out to the backyard while I was supposed to be watching him. I'm not even sure why I did it, but when I got back, he had knocked a glass bowl onto the floor and sliced his foot wide open. He was bawling his eyes out just like that. You can stay if you want, but I'm going." While I fumbled around for more excuses, Amy found the light switch and opened the staff room door. It was around 3 a.m., the blackest hour of the night, and the concrete plaza outside was covered by a fine layer of snow. The crying seemed to be coming from 2 or 3 aisles away, and Amy was already hurrying toward it. A heap of white sheets lay between the shelves. Something wiggled underneath. "Amy, stop!" I hissed, grabbing her wrist. She had dragged me halfway down the aisle toward the pile when the wrongness of the whole thing finally seemed to dawn on her. The bookstore's eerie yellowish lights, the lateness of the hour, the presence of that squirming bundle, with no sign of how it had come to be there or why. Whatever was beneath the blanket must have noticed our presence as well. After a few more half-hearted cries, it had stopped whimpering. It was waiting for us to come closer. When no one moved, the bundle of white cloth inched tentatively in our direction. Amy took a nervous step back, and suddenly it was scrambling toward us with a predator's speed, crying not from pain but from the thrill of the hunt. Amy and I crashed into each other in our mad dash for the staff room door. We closed and barricaded it behind us, but I wasn't sure if it would be enough. I usually survived the nights in Weeping Tree Books by laying low and not drawing attention to myself, not by having some sort of defense system. Something slammed against the door hard enough to rattle it. Amy and I braced it with our backs and felt the second slam reverberate through our bones. I didn't think the hinges could survive a third blow. The bookstore fell silent, and then we heard it, a low, moaning cry, trying to lure us out once more. After what felt like an eternity, it gave up, or at least seemed to. The only noise was the rumble of the heating system and our own panting, frightened breaths. What the hell was that? I told Amy everything. If there was ever a time that she might believe me, it was now. To my surprise, she accepted the whole story at face value. As some of the stuff you're describing reminds me of the scary stories that my grandmother used to tell. She used to swear that they were true, and she was no fool. Besides, Amy added, the idea of a bookstore that defies the laws of physics, it's actually not too far off from what I was studying. Amy explained that Dr. Balash, her thesis mentor, specialized in the study of anomalies in physics, places where gravity seemed to work the wrong way or that it measured larger on the inside than on the outside. He saw himself as a champion for truth, disproving what he considered to be crackpot conspiracy theories and bad science. I always got the impression that Dr. Balash actually had two lines of research, a public one that he shared with the world, and a private one that was limited to just a few of his preferred students, like Jacob. At the time, I felt awful about not being admitted to his inner circle, but looking back, I'm almost grateful. The more time that passes, the more it feels like a cult. There was no way that Amy and I were getting back to sleep after what we had just experienced, so we talked until we saw daylight through the crack beneath the door. When Amy yanked it open, I held the chair at the ready just in case. But there was nothing on the other side apart from an abandoned white sheet and some fresh, fingernail-sized scrapes on the door. "If you don't want to come back," I told Amy, "trust me, I understand." "Are you kidding?" Amy shook her head. "This is the most incredible thing that I've ever seen, and it was right across from my parents' restaurant all along." For an awful moment, I feared that the store would trap Amy on her way past the display case, just as it did for me. But then she was out in the snowy plaza, waving at me through the cheerful lights that she had hung up in the bookshop window. She headed back toward the restaurant to get to our breakfast, and I put some water in the kettle for our tea. I was about to turn the hot plate on when all hell broke loose. The dusty bell swung wildly as a boot crashed into the front door of Weeping Tree Books. It was the man in the brown leather jacket with a gun pressed against Amy's head. The young red-headed guy followed after him, along with a short-haired woman in round spectacles who I had never seen before. "Jesus, Jacob," Amy screamed. "What the hell are you doing?" The man called Jacob gestured at me with his pistol. "Do as you're told and nobody gets hurt," he snapped. I lifted my hands. The whole thing felt unreal, like I was playing a part in some old movie. There isn't much in the till, I informed him, but you can have it all. The redhead and the woman in the glasses looked at each other and laughed. Money? You think we're after money? Jacob jabbed his pistol toward the interior of the bookstore. There's stuff in there that's worth more than all the silver and gold in the world combined. But you know that already, don't you? I want you two lined up 10 feet ahead of me on the blue cable. We're gonna take a little stroll. If one of you tries to run, I shoot the other. How's that for a deal? I followed Jacob's orders, trying to arrange my thoughts. Although our captor made a big show of waving the pistol around, I could tell from the tense and practical way that he held it that he wasn't used to firearms. He was, however, aware of the blue cable that served as a guide through the dark fathoms of the bookstore. I wondered how much more he knew. Before long, the plaza outside the window disappeared from view. Wherever Jacob was taking us, I had a feeling that it would be a while before we got there. How long had his last trip into the bookstore last? 6 hours, even more. Did Dr. Balash put you up to this? Amy had asked. And Jacob answered right away, forgetting his own orders to keep silent. Balash, he snorted. You've got to be kidding me. He's been hoarding information on places like this for years, and he never once considered how useful it might be. When I think about all the hours that I spent under his thumb, calibrating instruments and doing research that would never see the light of day, well, Jacob smirked. All that wasted time did have one benefit. I met you. What are you talking about? Amy demanded. Places like this leave an electromagnetic residue that Dr. Balash's tools are designed to measure. You didn't notice, but when you walked into his office for the first time, all the gauges went off the charts. Otherwise, I never would have been able to convince him to admit you into the program. Jacob laughed at Amy's stunned silence. What? You thought you made it into a top physics program at a top university on merit alone? The only thing Balash and the rest of us wanted from you was this location, and now we've got it. He waved his pistol around as though trying to reassert his authority. Now keep walking. Although I ventured into the depths of Weeping Tree books every day, I never quite got used to the experience. Those endless aisles of ugly carpet, those glowing incandescent light bulbs set just far enough apart to create pools of shadow. Those shoddy particle board shelves that seemed to move whenever they weren't being watched. And above all, the lingering, inescapable sensation that something was following, on the ceiling, around a corner, somewhere just out of sight. Most people couldn't stand it for more than a few minutes, but Jacob and his crew hardly seemed to notice. I wondered whether it was because they had been in places like this before, or if they were just too fixated on finding whatever they were looking for to notice. My legs were beginning to ache by the time that we encountered the red cable at the top of a spiral staircase. Here, Jacob informed the others. His crew stopped, placed their black backpacks on the floor and paused for a break. Jacob tossed Amy and I a water bottle and some energy bars. You see, I'm not a monster. Not as long as you both cooperate. We ate in silence and then continued down the stairs. That oppressive feeling of being observed only grew stronger. It was as though we were passing through the entrails of some enormous beast. I knew from experience that the further one wandered from the main floor, the less stable and more dangerous Weeping Tree books became. But were Jacob and his crew aware of that fact? The way they had taken out flashlights and rope during our break suggested that they were, but I doubted this trio of graduate students fully understood what they were getting themselves into. Still, it raised an uncomfortable question. If Jacob didn't need us to help him navigate the bookstore, then why had he brought us along at all? I lost count of how many floors we passed. Some were lit by cheery lights, without a single book in a language that I couldn't identify. Others were all dark wood shelves and dusty tomes, as gloomy and ominous as the inside of an anglerfish's mouth. The steps had changed as well, becoming wide concrete slabs or narrow wooden slats, depending on the level that we were passing. Each time I rounded a corner, I expected some unknowable horror to leap up and drag me into the darkness, but the monster that I was expecting never came. Maybe, I thought, as I listened to Jacob mutter to one of his accomplices, we had brought the monsters in here with us. My one comfort was the presence of the red cable, winding its way down the central column of the staircase like some endless crimson serpent. I took advantage of the distraction to look back at my captors, and at Amy. She was drumming her fingers nervously on her jeans. Behind her, Jacob and the redhead were inspecting a small silver device and nodding at one another. The woman with glasses had taken over the gun and aimed it unwaveringly at Amy and I. Unlike Jacob, it was clear from her stance and trigger control that she knew what she was doing. Phones and internet didn't work inside of Weeping Tree Books, but the device in the redhead's palm seemed simpler than that, almost like a mercury thermometer for supernatural activity. I realized that it was probably the same device that I had seen him using in the plaza several days earlier, and while I couldn't imagine what it might be pointing to, we seemed to be almost there. Black and white were the only colors on the next floor. The surgically bright fluorescent lights were a far cry from the cozy, incandescent bulbs that I was used to, and the polished tile floor gave the place the ambience of a sinister hospital. The shelves were all white metal, and binders lining them were all the same identical shade of black. With my red sweater and khaki pants, I felt like an invader as we exited the stairwell. Suddenly, I wanted very badly to hold Amy's hand, or anybody's hand for that matter. This didn't seem like a place where humans should go. Jacob cleared his throat. I got moving. There was no text on the shelves here, nor any indication of where we should go apart from the redhead's weird device. I kept glancing back at the stairs, hoping that they wouldn't just disappear. The total silence magnified the echo of pages turning up ahead. Jacob nodded to the woman in glasses, who lowered her pistol slightly as we crossed into the next aisle. The man in the center turned around like he had been expecting us. His striped pants, suspenders, and white-collared shirt had probably been stylish about 100 years ago, but now they were in tatters. He wore his wide-brimmed hat pulled low, hiding his face from view, but something about his mustache and sideburns seemed familiar. "Arthur Lane Mackle?" Jacob inquired. The man smiled, revealing hideously receded purplish black gums. The name triggered something in my memory, that ever-tightening aisle, the corpses, the locket, ALM. Arthur Lane Mackle. I was looking at the last living member of that butchered family, although I wasn't sure living was the right word. His skin was pale as death, and the stuff flowing through the veins underneath looked more like ink than blood. "I brought what you asked for," announced Jacob. "Good lad," Arthur cackled. "Here." He rasped, pulling one of the black binders free and ripping out a page. "This one might interest you. On the fabrication of plagues, written by a 16th century warlock. Very rare, very effective, and very valuable to the people up there, I'm sure." The paper that he handed to Jacob seemed to be a map of sorts, a guide from this room to a specific shelf in the bookstore. I noticed something else as well. The bumps on the spine of the binder and along the shelves weren't any accident. They were braille. "I understand why you wanted us to bring you the girl," Jacob commented as he pocketed the paper. "It must be awfully lonely down here. But what about him?" Arthur chuckled. "Would you believe that I actually volunteered to be the bookkeeper? I was 26 and the Great War was on, and we couldn't risk the enemy gaining access to the anomalous places like this one. I thought that I had the stomach for it. I even moved my family in here with me. I thought that one little bookstore couldn't possibly be worse than the battlefields that I had seen in France. But I was wrong. Arthur circled around me. Something about this place brought my memories to life. The foes that I had killed, the friends I had lost. I could see them, smell them, hear their screams because in a way, I had brought them in here with me too. And as you all know, there was no escape. Day after day, year after year, it was that sort of torture that drives a man to consider insane possibilities and do awful things, even to the people that he loves. I offered up my wife and child to any power in this accursed place that could free me from my role as a bookkeeper. And you know what? Something answered. Its promise was a trap. I should have known better than to imagine that I would ever be allowed to leave. Instead of the bookkeeper, it transformed me into the Codex. I know the location of every volume in Weeping Tree books, and yet I cannot read a single one. Arthur removed his hat, revealing a pair of black pits where his eyes had once been. I'm sure you've got quite a lovely set of peepers yourself, lad. You two, hold him. I don't want us struggling to damage those lovely green eyes. Jacob and the redhead moved to grip my arms, and then everything seemed to happen at once. Amy grabbed a binder, chucked it at the girl in glasses, and bolted. The girl in glasses fired her pistol. Her shot went wide and hit the thing that had once been Arthur Lane Mackle in the gut. A viscous black liquid, like ink, oozed from his wound onto the tile. But the Codex barely seemed to notice. He was focused on me and acquiring the pair of eyes that he had been promised. Before the girl in glasses could re-establish her aim, I dashed in the opposite direction from Amy. It would be harder to catch both of us, I figured, and eventually I could circle back around, provided of course that I didn't get lost or caught. The Codex might not have been able to see, but my running footsteps were enough for him to pinpoint my location. He, Jacob, and the girl in glasses were hot on my heels. Only the redhead appeared to have gone after Amy. Another shot rang out, punching a hole in a binder just beside my left leg. I had gotten lucky 2 times, but I doubted that there would be a third. I was raising my arms to surrender when a shriek made me spin around. The Codex had snapped the neck of the girl with glasses, and now it was turning on Jacob, pinning him to the shelves with one hand and reaching toward his face with the other. I looked away in time to avoid witnessing what he did, but I couldn't blot out the fleshy sound of an eyeball being plucked from its socket. And then another. The Codex had no intention of helping me or Jacob, I realized. All it wanted was its sight restored and a fellow prisoner with whom to pass the time. The terrible knowledge that he had promised to Dr. Balash's students had never been anything more than a distraction. Behind me, the Codex was laughing, a dry, rasping sound that couldn't entirely drown out Jacob's agonized groans. The colors, they're so beautiful. I ran through the endless aisles, shouting Amy's name. The only response was the echoing footsteps of the Codex, approaching faster and faster behind me. I swerved left and right, hoping to lose him, but it was hopeless. This labyrinth was his domain, and I could no longer even guess in which direction the stairs might lie. A hand shot out from the next aisle. Amy pushed me up against the shelves and pressed a finger to my lips. Even faster footfalls were approaching from our left. "You little," the redhead roared. "Get back here." He charged right past us and then stopped dead. He had come face to face with the Codex. There were sounds of a scuffle of fists and boots connecting with flesh. It ended with a strangled cry. Amy was already pulling me in the opposite direction. "I found something," she whispered. "Come on." Another right, another left, and then I saw it. A torn-off yellow cable dangling from a shaft in the wall. I thought back to Anna, the bookkeeper who had first placed the cables into her final torn-out journal entry. She hadn't been following the yellow cable to the exit. She had been following it to the codex, hoping that even as a captive of the bookstore himself, he might know a way out. It was possible that I really hadn't imagined the sensation of something breathing at the other end of the narrow tunnel during my own escape attempt. He might have been there all along, waiting eagerly for another chance to steal a pair of eyes. "I know where this leads," I told Amy, "but I should probably go first, just in case." We took one last look around the black and white maze of Weeping Tree Books, a record room. The quiet was unsettling. Where had the codex gone? Was he still busy with what was left of Jacob and his crew? I heaved myself up the cable and into the claustrophobic space, which was about as wide around as an air duct. Dragging myself forward into the dark with a single arm outstretched, I felt like a foolhardy caver. What would I do if I got stuck or if the space closed in around me? I bent around a spine-cracking corner and finally saw light at the end of the tunnel. I recognized the room ahead and those 3 innocent victims as freshly dead as if Arthur Mackle had killed them only a few minutes before. As I scrambled free of the narrow space, I could hear Amy still struggling in the tunnel behind me. I warned her not to look too closely at the room that she was about to see. She had just rounded the hairpin turn when her eyes widened. Without warning, she slipped backward. "He's got me," Amy yelped. I grabbed her arms and pulled. Amy screamed, caught in a painful tug-of-war, one that I knew I would lose. I could feel the muscles in my legs starting to give out. The codex had more hateful strength than a single hand that I had in my whole body. And then, with a snap and a grunt, Amy slipped free and came crashing out onto my chest. I almost didn't want to inspect the damage. What if her foot had been torn off, or worse? A bruising, bloodied handprint covered Amy's bare ankle, but the only thing missing was her sock and sneaker. The codex didn't come crawling out of that awful tunnel after us, probably because he was a prisoner of the records room, just as I was a prisoner of the rest of the store. A fact which made me realize exactly how much Arthur Mackle's bitter sacrifice had cost him. Rather than being trapped for one lifespan in the bizarre bookstore, he was trapped for eternity in a single room, a room that up until now he had been unable to even see. "Are you all right?" I asked Amy. "No, but I'll live." Amy limped to a standing position and draped her arm around my shoulders. Side by side, we limped back to the front desk of Weeping Tree Books. This episode is sponsored by Rocket Money. I had one of those moments recently where I finally sat down and looked at my finances and I immediately regretted it. There were charges that I didn't recognize, subscriptions that I forgot about, and it was all just a mess. I realized I was spending way more time stressing about money than actually managing it. That's when I started using Rocket Money, and it honestly made things way simpler. It pulls all your accounts into one place so that you can actually see what's going on without digging through a bunch of apps. One of the biggest things for me was the subscription tracking. I didn't even realize how many things I was still paying for. Rocket Money can help you find those and cancel the ones that you don't want, all within the app. It also automatically categorizes your spending so that you can see where your money's really going. For me, it was eating out, way more than I thought. Being able to actually see that helped me start cutting back and setting more realistic budgets. And you can set goals too. People who create a financial goal with Rocket Money save over $70 on average within the first 30 days. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so that you can grow your savings. Let Rocket Money help you reach your financial goals faster. Join at rocketmoney.com/Mr. Creeps. That's rocketmoney.com/Mr. Creeps. rocketmoney.com/Mr. Creeps. I've been thinking about whether to do this for a long time, and not because I'm worried about what happens to me. The office will not come for me because the office does not work that way. The most effective classification system ever invented is not a locked file cabinet or a server behind a firewall. It is the certainty that anything I say publicly will be dismissed as fiction. I could describe every job that I've ever worked in exact detail and post it on the internet, and the result would be that a few thousand people would read it, and most of them would assume that it's made up. That is the security model. Public disbelief. It has never failed. For the past 8 years, I have worked for a division of the federal government that doesn't have a public-facing name. I call it the office. On paper, it operates under the Department of the Interior. In practice, it answers to a small interagency committee that I have never met and communicate with only through my handler, a woman named Delia Marsh. My job, if it had a title, would be something like containment or recovery specialist. In plain language, I find things the government created or caused or allowed to happen, and I deal with them before the public finds out. Before the office, I spent 12 years as a wildlife management officer for the state of Wyoming. I tracked problem animals in the backcountry, wolves that killed livestock, mountain lions that wandered too close to subdivisions, bears that had lost their fear of humans and needed to be relocated or put down. And I was good at it. I was good at finding things in difficult terrain that did not want to be found. The office recruited me because they needed that skill set for targets that were not animals, or were not entirely animals, or were not animals anymore. I am going to tell you about 3 jobs, 3 incidents, 3 mistakes. The details are exact. The locations are real, though I have changed some names. The things that I saw are described the way that I saw them, without exaggeration. And these are not the worst jobs that I've worked, and they are not the strangest. And they are the ones that I think about the most, the ones that come back to me in the quiet moments. Here is how the work operates. I get a call from Delia. She gives me a location and a briefing, which is usually short because the office often doesn't know exactly what it is sending me into. I drive to the location, I assess the situation, I contain whatever needs containing, and then I report back. The office will send a cleanup crew if one is needed, and then I leave. The incident is filed into a system that I do not have access to, and life moves on. I live alone in a rented house outside of Casper, Wyoming. No wife, no kids, and no close friends. The work doesn't allow for it. Not because the office forbids relationships, because once you have seen what I have seen, you can't sit across a dinner table from somebody that you care about and pretend that the world makes sense. You can't send a woman a good morning text and then drive to a valley in Utah where the cattle have stopped moving and something that is not cattle is standing among them wearing their shape. The two realities do not fit inside the same life. I'm telling you all this because I think people deserve to know, even if knowing will not change anything. Even if the only thing it changes is the way you look at a stretch of empty highway, or a fenced-off parcel of federal land, or a road that has been closed for repairs that never seem to end. Here are my stories. Late September 3 years ago, Delia called me on a Tuesday morning. She said that a state highway maintenance crew in eastern Montana had found something in a drainage ditch and one of the workers had to be hospitalized. She didn't have details on what the worker saw. She gave me coordinates and told me to go take a look. I drove out the next day. Eastern Montana is a place that most Americans have never seen and cannot picture. It is not the Montana on the tourist brochures. The mountains and the rivers and the fly fishing. Eastern Montana is grassland. It is enormous and flat and dry, and it goes on forever. The sky is so big out there that it feels like the land is just a narrow strip between two infinite blue walls. You can drive for an hour and see nothing but grass and fence posts, and the occasional pronghorn standing on a ridge watching you pass. The site was on a 2-lane state highway between two small towns called Selden and Garfield Crossing. I found it easily, a concrete ditch running under the road, used for drainage on the north side to a dry creek bed on the south. Standard highway drainage infrastructure. It was about 4 feet in diameter and roughly 60 feet long. The north opening was partially clogged with tumbleweeds and dried silt. The south opening emptied into a shallow creek bed choked with dead grass. I had a flashlight, a 50-foot rope, and a sidearm. I was alone. And the office does not send teams for assessment. Teams come after, once I tell them what they're dealing with. I went in from the north side. The pipe was tight. 4 feet is big enough to crouch walk, but not big enough to stand or move quickly. The floor was silty and damp, the kind of accumulated sediment you would find in any culvert that has been sitting under a highway for decades. The culvert was 60 feet long. I should have been able to see daylight from the south opening within a few seconds of entering. I could not. The pipe stretched ahead of me and the flashlight beam dissolved into darkness, and there was no circle of daylight at the far end. I kept walking. I counted my steps. At 60 steps, which should have put me well past the south opening and out on the other side, the pipe was still going. The walls were all the same. The silt on the floor hadn't changed. But the distance was all wrong. I had been walking for what felt like 3 minutes inside a pipe that should have taken maybe 30 seconds to cross. I stopped. I turned my flashlight behind me. The north opening was still there, a small circle of gray daylight, but it was much further away than it should have been. I had entered a 60-foot culvert and I had walked at least 150 feet and I was still inside of it. Now I want to be clear about something. I am not describing a magic trick. I'm not describing a hallway that stretches or a room that changes size. This culvert was concrete. It was real. It was physically longer on the inside than it was on the outside. Whatever was injected into the ground beneath that highway in the 1960s had done something to the space itself, or it had grown the culvert outward from the inside, the way that a vine grows through a crack in a wall, extending it, adding to it, making more of it. I don't know the mechanism. I know what I measured with my own feet. I turned back around and kept going. The air changed. It became warmer and wetter, and it picked up a smell that I can only describe as organic. Not rot, not decay, but something alive. Like the inside of a large animal. Like putting your face close to the belly of a horse and breathing in. The concrete walls were no longer clean. They were coated in something dark and slick that caught the light from my flashlight and gave it back in a dull sheen. I did not touch it. The silt on the floor had been replaced by a substance that was softer, that compressed under my boots and sprang slowly back. It had the texture of wet muscle. And then my flashlight found what the highway worker found. In the center, roughly 200 feet from the entrance of the 60-foot pipe, there was a mass of biological material. I'm choosing my words carefully here. It was tissue and it was alive. It was growing out of the walls and the floor and the ceiling, fused with the concrete the way that a tree root fuses with a sidewalk over decades. It was dark red and vascular. I could see veins running through it. Thick ones, pulsing with a slow rhythm that I could feel through my boots. It was warm. The heat radiating from it was noticeable from 10 feet away, and it filled most of the pipe, leaving only a narrow gap at the top between the mass and the ceiling that I could have squeezed through if I had wanted to. I did not want to. It was organized, but not in any way that I recognized. Not like an organ or a body or any anatomy that I had seen in an animal. It was structured, but the structure was its own. It had a heartbeat, slow and heavy and steady. The mass was maybe 15 feet long, and it filled the culvert from wall to wall, and it had been growing for a very long time. Decades, I would guess, based on how thoroughly it had bonded with the concrete. It was not sitting in the culvert. It was a part of it. The pipe had become its body. I backed out, slowly, watching it the entire time, though it didn't move and it showed no sign of awareness. It was not an animal. It was not reacting to my presence. It was just growing, living and growing and pulsing in the dark the way that it had been doing since whatever the government put in the ground in the 1960s had found its way into this pipe. I called Delia from my truck. I asked her what was at this location before the highway. She checked and told me the highway was built in 1974 on a route that crossed a parcel of land leased by the Department of Defense from 1961 to 1969. The lease was for soil testing. I asked what kind. She said the records were sealed, but the land was used for underground injection trials. The substance injected was classified. The project was terminated in 1969. The land returned to the state. The highway was built over it 5 years later. I told Delia that whatever they had injected was still alive and it was growing. It had colonized the culvert and almost certainly the surrounding soil. I recommended excavation and containment. She said that she would send in a team. I drove back to Casper. 2 months later, I checked in with Delia. The team had excavated the culvert and the surrounding area to a depth of 20 feet. The biological mass extended through the soil in a network that covered roughly 3 acres. All of it was alive, all of it growing at a measurable rate. They removed what they could and sealed the rest under a concrete cap. The highway was reopened with no public explanation for the 10-day closure. The local paper reported it as an emergency road repair. The part that stays with me is not the mass in the culvert. It's the fact that it grew for over 50 years under that highway without anybody knowing. 50 years. Every car and truck that drove over that stretch of road between Selden and Garfield Crossing was driving over something alive. Something with a beating heart. Something that was fused into the concrete and spreading slowly outward through the Montana soil for half a century. And if a highway worker hadn't crawled into a drainage pipe to clear some tumbleweeds, nobody would have ever known. I think about that sometimes. How many culverts are there in this country? How many miles of highway are built over old government land? How many underground spaces where something might be growing right now, in the dark where nobody's looking? I try not to think about it too much. The hardest part of this work is not the danger, it isn't the isolation. It's the knowledge. Once you know that the government buried something alive under a highway in Montana in 1969, you can't unlearn that. You carry it. Every highway you drive on, every stretch of fenced-off federal land you see from a car window, you wonder, what's down there? What's been done here? What was left behind? Here's the second story. Mid-July 2 years ago, Delia called and told me that a rancher in west central Utah had reported a problem with his cattle. The rancher's name was Boyd Sutter. He ran about 80 head of beef cattle on a grazing lease in a broad, dry valley between two mountain ranges. The valley was accessible only by a single unpaved road. The nearest town was Callaway, population maybe 200, a former mining settlement that existed mostly as a waypoint for ranchers. The valley was public land in theory, but so remote that nobody went there except the occasional hunter. Boyd moved his cattle into the valley every spring and brought them out in early fall. He had been doing it for 20 years. This July, when he drove in to check the herd, the cattle were wrong. They were clustered in the center of the valley, standing in a tight-knit group, motionless and all facing inward. They would not respond to his truck horn. They wouldn't respond to his voice. He approached on foot and they did not flee. Heck, they didn't react at all. He said they were standing so still that from a distance they looked like statues. He said their eyes were open, but he couldn't tell if they were seeing anything. And he said the herd seemed larger than when he had left it. And the Bureau of Land Management sent an officer to investigate. The officer drove into the valley, looked at the herd through binoculars from about a quarter-mile away, drove back out, and filed a report through channels that eventually reached the office. I don't know exactly what the officer saw through those binoculars, but I do know that he took early retirement 2 weeks later and moved to the Gulf Coast of Florida. The report did not include photographs. I drove to the valley. It took most of a day on bad roads. The landscape out there is sage and bunch grass and dry pale dirt under a sky that is so blue, it almost looks like it has been painted. The mountains on either side of the valley are low and dry. No trees except a few junipers on the ridge. Visibility is perfect, which is both a comfort and a concern, because I could see the herd from miles away. They were in the center of the valley, a dark mass on the valley floor, motionless. I stopped my truck about a half-mile out and I lifted my binoculars. I counted. There were more than 80. I reached 112 before the bodies at the center of the cluster became too tightly packed to distinguish individually. Boyd runs 80 ahead. There were at least 30 extra animals in that herd, possibly more. I drove closer, about a quarter-mile. The cattle were standing in concentric rings, all facing inward toward the center of the formation. Their bodies were pressed close, shoulder to shoulder, flank to flank. I could not see them breathing. I got out of my truck. I walked toward the herd. The valley was perfectly still. No wind, no birds, no insects. The air was hot and still, and the only sound was my boots on the dry ground and the faint creak of my gear. The cattle did not react to my approach. I got within 100 yards and I stopped. Something was wrong with them beyond the stillness. It took me a moment to identify it. The cattle in the outer ring looked normal, like standard range cattle. Red and black and brindled hides, heavy bodies, the typical proportions you see in any beef herd in the western states. But the cattle further in, the ones in the second and third rings, they were different. Their proportions were off. Their legs were slightly too long. The bodies were a little too narrow. Heads the right shape but set too far forward on the neck, angled down, as if they were staring at the ground instead of looking ahead. The difference was subtle in the second ring. By the third ring, though, it was obvious. And the innermost cattle, the ones that I could barely see through the press of bodies, they didn't look entirely like cattle anymore. The shapes of them were close and the size seemed to be right, but the proportions were wrong in a way that my brain registered as deeply and fundamentally incorrect. Like a drawing of a cow made by something that had seen a cow from a distance but had never stood right next to one. I understood. The extra animals were not Boyd's cattle, they were something else. They had joined the herd and grown within it, or been produced by whatever was happening in that valley. And they were shaped like cattle because cattle was what surrounded them. They were mimicking the form, filling in, blending. And the Rio cattle were frozen in their rings, standing motionless and facing inward, held in place by whatever was at the center of the formation. The thing they were all looking at. The thing I could not see because the press of bodies was too tight, and I would have to walk into the herd to reach it. I wasn't going to walk into that herd. I went back to my truck and I called Delia. I told her that the herd seemed to be compromised. I told her that there were organisms in the valley that were assuming the physical characteristics of the cattle and integrating into the formation. I told her the Rio cattle appeared to be immobilized but alive. I recommended the entire herd be destroyed and that the valley be permanently closed. Delia asked me what was at the center, the thing that they were all facing. I said that I didn't get close enough to see. She asked if I wanted to go back with the team and I said no. I said that whatever was in there had put over 100 large animals into a state of total paralysis, and I wasn't really interested in finding out what it did when a human walked into the middle of it. And Delia said that she would send a team. And the team went in 2 weeks later, 6 people including armed personnel and a veterinary specialist. The team leader radioed a report at 11 in the morning. He said they were within 50 yards of the outer ring. He said that the cattle were still motionless. He said they were going to try to push through the formation to reach the center. And that was the last communication from the team. A recovery unit went in the following day. The herd was still there. The cattle had not moved. The team's vehicles were parked where they had left them. Their equipment was found on the ground. Their radios were in the dirt. There was no sign of the 6 people who had walked toward the herd the day before. No bodies, no clothing, no drag marks. Nothing. They were simply gone. The office quarantined the valley. They closed down the road, fenced the access points with government signage, and they filed paperwork as a grazing lease revocation due to persistent drought conditions. Boyd Sutter was compensated for the loss of his herd at market rate and signed a non-disclosure agreement. He moved to Price and took a job at a feed store. He does not talk about the valley. And the valley is still closed. As of the last satellite imagery that I've seen, the herd is still there. Still standing there in the center of it and still motionless, facing inward. The formation hasn't changed in 2 years, and they're still standing exactly where they were when I first saw them, as if they're waiting. For what, I don't know. Nobody knows. The office has decided not to find out. Delia told me later that the valley was used in the late 1970s for a series of atmospheric dispersal tests conducted by a joint military-civilian research program. A substance had been released over the valley, multiple dispersals over a period of about 3 years. The tests had concluded in 1981, and the site was listed as fully remediated. Whatever was sprayed into the air settled into the soil and the water table and the grass, and the cattle ate the grass and drank the water for 20 years and nothing happened. But then one summer, something woke up. I think about Boyd sometimes. The man did nothing wrong, but he had to drive away and lose everything and sign a paper that said that he would never speak about it. The mistake was made in a government office in 1977, and the cost was paid by a rancher in Utah almost 50 years later. And nobody will be held accountable because nobody outside the office even knows that it happened. That's how it works. That's how it always works. My third story is the one that cost me the most. In March of last year, Delia's briefing was longer than usual, which is never a good sign. When Delia talks for more than 2 minutes, it means the situation has layers to it. She told me the office had been monitoring a property in Harney County, Oregon for almost 2 years. Harney County is in the southeastern corner of the state. It's high desert, a sagebrush, a steppe. It is one of the largest and least populated counties in the lower 48. The landscape is vast and flat and empty, a way that makes eastern Montana look crowded. You can drive for an hour on a county road and not see another vehicle. The nearest town of any size is Burns, a population about 3,000. The property in question belonged to a man named Chet Linden. Chet was in his mid-50s, a former Bureau Land Management employee. He had worked as a wildland firefighter in his younger years and later as a facilities manager for a remote research station that was decommissioned in 2004. When the station shut down, Chet stayed in the area. He bought a small ranch property about 40 minutes south of Burns on a county road that sees maybe 10 vehicles a day. He lived there with his wife Nora and their 2 boys. And Delia told me that Chet had contacted the office in Burns about 18 months earlier, claiming that something was wrong with his land. He said that the ground behind his house was warm. Not hot, but warm. Noticeably warmer than the surrounding soil. He said it had started in a small area maybe 10 feet across near the back fence line. The warm area had been growing. The soil there was softer than the ground around it, and it had a faint vibration, like standing on top of a machine running at low speed somewhere below. The Bureau of Land Management sent out a field officer. The officer confirmed the warm soil and the vibration and filed a report. Somebody at a federal agency cross-referenced the location with old project records and found that Chet's property sat on the boundary of a site used from 1967 to 1972 for deep well injection experiments conducted by the Department of Energy. The injections were performed at a depth of roughly 800 feet, multiple wells. The project ran for 5 years. The wells were capped and sealed when it had ended. And Delia told me the warm area had continued to expand, and now covered most of the acreage behind the house, about 6 acres. The vibration was stronger. Chet's well water had changed. It was warmer than it used to be, and it had a taste that he described as metallic and sweet. His wife Nora was having persistent headaches, and the younger boy, who was 12, had started sleepwalking. Now, not ordinary sleepwalking. The boy would get out of bed in the middle of night, walk out of the house, and stand barefoot in the warm area behind the back fence, in the cold, in the dark, perfectly still. And when Chet brought him inside, the boy wouldn't remember any of it. Delia said the monitoring data suggested the subsurface activity was intensifying. She did not define what that meant. She sent me to assess whether the family needed to be relocated and whether the site needed active containment. I drove to the property. Southeastern Oregon is a landscape that does things to your sense of scale. The emptiness is so vast that distance loses meaning. You drive for an hour and the mountains on the horizon do not seem any closer. The land is flat sage in every direction, gray, green, and pale, with the occasional rimrock formation or dry lake bed breaking up the monotony. It's a place that feels older than most places, like the earth here hasn't been interrupted by anything in a very long time. The Linden property was a modest ranch house with a metal barn and a couple of outbuildings on about 20 acres. The driveway was a quarter-mile of gravel. When I pulled in, Chet was on the front porch. He had been expecting me. Delia had called ahead. Chet Linden was the kind of man you find in places like Harney County. Big, weathered hands that looked like they had been carved from hardwood. He did not waste words. He shook my hand and said that you're from the government, and I said yes, and he said let me show you the back, and that was the end of the small talk. He walked me around the house and through the back gate and into the acreage behind the property. I saw it immediately. I mean, the warm area was obvious. The sage that grew inside its boundary was taller and greener than the sage outside, which was wrong for March in the high desert when everything should be brown and dormant. Inside the warm area, the sage was shoulder height and bright green, lush in a way that looked almost tropical against the gray steppe around it. The boundary was sharp. You could stand with one foot in brown, dormant sage and the other foot in green, living sage, and the difference was so stark that it looked like somebody had drawn a line on the ground. I crouched at the edge and put my hand on the soil. Warm. Not uncomfortable, maybe 85 degrees. In March, when the ambient soil temperature should have been in the 30s, and the vibration, it was exactly as Chet described. A low, steady pulse, rhythmic, rising up through the ground and into my palm. It felt organic. It felt like putting your hand on the chest of something that was breathing. I walked the perimeter of the warm area. It was close to 7 acres, larger than what was originally reported, which meant that it had grown since the last assessment. It extended from behind the house to the property line and beyond, into the open land south of the fence. I crouched again at a different point and pressed my hand flat against the soil, and I held it there for a long time. The vibration was steady and even, like a heartbeat. And underneath it, deeper, slower, I could feel something else. Movement. Not the vibration, something separate. Something large, turning over slowly far below the surface. The way you might feel a passing whale under a small boat. A sense of enormous mass and motion, deep in the earth, moving in a way that was deliberate and slow. I talked to Chet. He stood with his arms folded and his jaws set, and he told me what had been happening. The warm area grew about a foot a week in every direction. The vibration was getting stronger month by month. His well water was warmer every time that he tested it. And Nora's headaches were constant now, and she had started getting nosebleeds. And bad ones. The kind where you fill a towel and it does not stop for 20 minutes. And the boy, the 12-year-old, the sleepwalking was almost nightly now. Chet had installed a lock on the boy's bedroom door, the kind that latched from the outside. He locked his own son in his room every night so that the boy could not walk out to the warm in the dark. Chet told me this with his jaw tight and his voice flat, and I could see what it was costing him to say it out loud. He knew how it sounded. A father locking his child's door from the outside. He knew that in any context that would be an unforgivable thing, anything normal. But this was not a normal context. The alternative was finding his son standing barefoot in a field of warm soil at 3 a.m, eyes open and unseeing, pulled there by something neither of them could explain. I told Chet the truth, or as much of it as I had. I told him about the Department of Energy injecting something into deep wells on this site over 50 years ago. I told him that the wells were sealed, but whatever was injected appeared to be active, and it was generating heat. It was expanding. It was affecting the water table and possibly the people living above it. And Chet absorbed it. I expected anger. I've been yelled at before by people who discover that their land, their water, their lives have been contaminated by something the government did before they were born. I've stood in kitchens and living rooms and fields while people raged at me, as if I were the one who had signed the orders. I understand the anger. I even think that it's justified. But Chet did not get angry, he just got tired. Or rather, he let me see the tiredness that had been there all along. The exhaustion of a man who had known for months that something was profoundly wrong with his home and his family, and who had been waiting for somebody to come and confirm it. He just nodded. He looked at the green sage behind his house and he nodded once and he asked me what he should do. I told him that his family needed to leave immediately. He said that he would talk to Nora and he said it would take a few days. I spent the night at a hotel in Burns. The next morning, I drove back to the Linden property. When I turned onto the county road, I could see the green sage from almost a mile away. It was larger, significantly larger. Overnight, it had expanded by dozens of feet in every direction. It had pushed past the back fence and was now within 20 feet of the house. The sage in the newly warm area was not just green, it was tall, well above shoulder height, and growing months or years in a single night. The vibration was strong enough that I could feel it in the driveway, through the gravel and the soles of my boots. The whole property felt like it was humming. Chet was in the kitchen. Nora was at the table. She looked bad, pale, thin, dark rings under her eyes. She was holding a folded cloth to her nose and the cloth was spotted with blood. She did not look up when I came in. She looked like a woman who had used up all her energy months ago and was running on something deeper and less renewable than energy. Something like obligation. Like she was staying upright because her children needed her to be upright, and for no other reason. Chet told me the boy had gone out again last night. The lock was engaged on his bedroom door, but the boy went out through his window. Chet found him again at 3 a.m, standing barefoot in the warm area, 50 feet from the house, the same as before. He wasn't responsive when he tried to call his name, or when he put his hand on his shoulder. He was just standing there in the dark and the cold in his pajamas with his bare feet on soil that was 85 degrees and the rest of him exposed to air that was below freezing. Chet picked him up and carried him inside. The boy did not resist and did not wake up. And his feet, which had been standing on the warm ground, were not warm. They were ice cold. As if the heat in the soil was not radiating up into the boy's body, but pulling something downward out of it. I told Chet the family was leaving today. Not in a few days, not after they had time to arrange things, but today, right now. Chet looked at Nora, and Nora looked down at the table. And then she stood up and walked to the bedroom and started putting clothes in a bag. And the older boy, who was 14, started carrying boxes to the truck without being asked. He hadn't said a word the entire time that I was there. He was old enough to understand what was happening and young enough that he could not do anything about it. And the expression on his face was one that I had seen before in this work. The expression of someone whose world has become something that they didn't agree to. While they packed, I walked to the edge of the warm area. It was closer to the house than it had been when I had arrived 30 minutes earlier. I could see it advancing. Not quickly, but visibly. The boundary between the dead brown sage and the impossible green sage was creeping toward the foundation at a pace of about a foot every few minutes. Slow by human standards, fast by any standard that involves the ground itself moving. I crouched at the edge. I put my hand flat on the soil. The vibration was intense and I could feel it in my wrist, in my elbow, and in my teeth. And underneath the vibration, that deep, slow movement. The thing down there. The thing that had been growing and rising ever since they had injected it in 1967. It was moving closer to the surface. Substantially closer than it had been the day before. Yesterday, the movement had felt deep, like a subway train far below a city street. Today, it felt like it was just under the floor of a building. Close and getting closer, and then it changed direction. I was kneeling with my palm on the ground and I felt it shift. The movement had been lateral, expanding outward, spreading through the soil toward the edges of the warm area. But now it was rising slowly and steadily toward the surface, toward my hand. I could feel it coming the way you feel the floor vibrate when a heavy truck is approaching. The vibration intensified. The soil under my hand got warmer, and something down there, something enormous and alive and patient, was moving up. I pulled my hand away. I stood up. I walked to the house and told Chet that they were leaving now, not in 20 minutes, not after one more load. They had to get out of here right now. Get in the truck and drive. The family immediately headed to their vehicle. Chet got behind the wheel, Nora in the passenger seat, and both boys in the back. I followed behind them in my truck. We drove out of the gravel driveway and onto the county road, and I watched the property shrink in my mirror. The house looked the same. The barn looked the same. But the sage behind the house was taller than it had been when we left, and the green area was wider and it was still growing. The office sent a containment team the following week. I was not part of it. Delia briefed me afterward. The team arrived and found that the warm area had made it to the house. The foundation was compromised. The house was sinking. Not collapsing, but sinking and being drawn downward. The soil beneath the foundation had become soft and warm and yielding, and the house was settling into it slowly, like a heavy object settling into wet sand. The porch was 6 inches lower than it should have been. The door frames were racked. The concrete slab had cracked in 3 places. The team assessed and withdrew. The office arranged for the property to be condemned through the county building department, citing foundation failure. The county road past the property was closed for what was described as a bridge inspection. The Linden family was relocated to Boise under a federal assistance program that does not appear in any public record. I called Chet about a month later. He said the family was getting by. They had an apartment in Boise. Nora's headaches stopped within a week of leaving, and her nosebleed stopped within a few days after that. The older boy had started at a new school and was handling it. He was a steady kid, he would be all right. The younger boy was still sleepwalking. And not every night, not as frequently as before, but still pretty often. And it had changed. He was no longer walking outside. He was walking to the front door of the apartment. Chet would find him in the middle of the night, standing at the door with his hand on the knob, eyes open, expressionless, facing south toward Harney County. Every time it was the same. He wasn't trying to open the door, just standing there with his hand on the knob like he was waiting for permission, or waiting for something to tell him that it was time. Chet said again the boy never remembered any of it in the morning. I talked to Delia after that call. She told me that the warm area on the Linden property had expanded to over 40 acres. The house had sunk almost 2 feet into the ground and the barn was leaning at a visible angle. The well had collapsed and the casing pulled down into the softening earth. And satellite imagery showed that the warm area was not circular. It was not expanding evenly in all directions. It was spreading along the paths of the underground wells, following the injection routes from the 1960s, reaching outward through the desert like fingers following the veins in the rock, reaching toward the neighboring properties, toward the road, and patiently toward Burns. Now I know I promised only 3 stories. But going through all these old jobs stirred up some memories that I must have forgotten. So let's do one more. Why not? This is the one job that most closely resembled the work that I used to do for the state of Wyoming, and that made it worse in a way that I did not anticipate. Tracking a problem animal through backcountry is something that my body knows how to do. My legs know the pace. My eyes know what to look for. Broken branches, disturbed soil, hair caught on bark. When Delia called me in early November about 18 months ago and told me that I was going to the Bitterroot Mountains in central Idaho to track something, part of me felt almost relieved. This was work that I understood. I was wrong about that though. I understood the method. I did not understand what I was tracking. The briefing was short, even by Delia's standards. She told me that the Forest Service had received a cluster of reports from elk hunters in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness. 3 separate hunting parties over a span of about 2 weeks had reported encountering an animal that they could not identify. The descriptions were inconsistent in the specifics but consistent in the broad strokes. Large, bipedal, or at least capable of bipedal movement. Dark in color, fast. Each party encountered it at a different location, but all 3 were in the same drainage. A long, narrow valley following a tributary of the Selway River about 30 miles from the nearest road. One hunter described it as a bear walking upright, except the proportions were wrong. The arms were too long. The head was too small. The gait was smooth and not the shuffling, unbalanced walk of a bear on its hind legs, but a fluid and purposeful stride, like something built to walk that way. The second group saw it at dusk from across the meadow. They said that it was standing at the tree line watching their camp, and they estimated it at 7 feet tall. One of the hunters looked at it through his rifle scope and put the gun down and told the others that they were leaving. He would not say what he saw through the scope. The group packed out that night, hiking 4 hours in the dark to reach their vehicles. The third party did not see it. They heard it, moving through the timber above their camp in the middle of the night. Heavy footfalls, branches breaking. They said that it circled their camp twice. They said it made a sound they described as breathing, but too loud, like the exhale of something with lungs larger than any animal they knew of, deep and resonant and close. One of the hunters discharged his rifle into the trees. The sound stopped. In the morning, they found tracks in the soft ground above the camp. The tracks were not consistent with any known species. They were roughly 18 inches long and showed 5 digits like a hand, but compressed and elongated, as if something that normally walked on 4 limbs had been walking on 2, and its front feet had been bearing weight that they were not designed for. The Forest Service does not have a protocol for unidentified bipedal animals. They filed their reports and somebody at the regional office flagged them, and the flag found its way through the interagency channels that led to Delia. She told me to go in and track it, find it if I could, identify it, determine if it was a threat, determine if it was one of ours. That last part is the part that matters. Determine if it was one of ours. Because the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness sits adjacent to a stretch of national forest that was used by the Department of Defense in the early 70s for a program that Delia described only as a biological enrichment study. She said the program involved the release of modified organisms into a controlled forest environment to observe adaptation and survival rates. The organisms were classified. The study ran for 3 years and it was terminated in 1974. The containment protocols at the conclusion of the study called for the recovery and destruction of all released organisms. She said the recovery was listed as complete. She said every organism was accounted for in the project's final inventory. I asked Delia how confident the office was in that inventory. She said not confident enough or she would not be sending me. I drove to Idaho. I spent a day in the town of Darby, Montana, just across the border organizing my gear, and then I hiked into the wilderness. I want to describe the Bitterroot because the landscape matters. And this is not a groomed national park with trails and signage. The Selway Bitterroot is one of the largest wilderness areas in the lower 48. It is steep, dense, old-growth forest, cut by deep drainages and narrow ridgelines. The canopy in the valley bottoms is so thick that even at midday, the light on the forest floor is dim and green and filtered. The undergrowth is heavy. Visibility is often less than 50 yards. The terrain is the kind of country where a bull elk can stand 100 feet from you and you will not see it until it moves. It is excellent country for something that does not want to be found. I hiked to where the sightings occurred. It took a day and a half. I set up a base camp on a flat bench above the creek and I started working. I'm a good tracker, I'll say that without modesty because it's relevant. I spent 12 years tracking predators through the Wyoming backcountry, and I can read ground signs and conditions that would frustrate most people. Compressed grass, overturned pebbles, the faint disturbance in a bed of pine needles where something heavy passed through hours ago. I am patient, I am thorough, and I know what I'm doing. I found something on the first day, a game trail on the north side of the drainage that had been used by something heavy. The tracks were faint but present, pressed into a patch of damp soil where the trail crossed a seep. 5 digits, 18 inches roughly, deeper at the toe than the heel, which indicated a forward-leaning posture. Bipedal, walking with purpose, not wandering. The stride length was about 4 feet, which for a 7-foot animal would indicate a relaxed walking pace. Not hurrying, not fleeing, just moving through its territory. I followed the tracks up the drainage for about 2 miles. They stayed on the game trail and then they left it, cutting uphill through heavy timber toward the ridgeline. The ground was drier on the slope and the tracks faded. I lost them halfway up. I spent 2 more days working the drainage. I found tracks in 3 other locations. I found a place where something had bedded down in a thicket of young firs. The branches pushed aside and the ground compressed in an oval of about 6 feet long. I found droppings once in a rocky wash. I will not describe it in detail except to say that it was large, and it didn't match any species that I knew, and it contained material that I could not identify. Not bones or vegetation, something fibrous and dark that I didn't recognize. On the 4th night, I heard it. I was in my tent at about 2 in the morning. The forest was quiet, the way that deep wilderness is quiet at night, which is not truly quiet at all. Owls, creek water, the occasional branch falling. But underneath those sounds, there's a bass line, a hum of living things, insects and small mammals, and the general ambient noise of an ecosystem at rest. That bass line dropped out, the way it does when a large predator enters the area. Everything small goes silent. Every bird tucks its head. The forest holds its breath. I lay in my sleeping bag and I listened. I could hear something moving through the timber uphill from my camp, heavy and slow. It was walking through the trees about 100 yards above me, moving laterally across the slope. I could hear branches deflecting, not breaking, but deflecting, which told me the animal was aware of its body in space and it was moving carefully. A bear crashes through the brush. A deer pushes through it. Whatever it was treading through the timber the way that a person treads through a crowd, aware and intentional. It stopped, directly above my camp. 100 yards uphill in the dark timber. I could not see anything. The canopy blocked the moonlight and the trees were black columns fading into deeper black, but I could feel it, the way you feel someone watching you from across a room. An attention, a focus. It was standing in the dark and it was looking down at my camp and it knew that I was there. And then the breathing. The hunters were right, it was too loud, too deep. The exhale of something with a chest cavity larger than a horse, pushing air through a throat that resonated like a pipe organ. I could feel it in my sternum. A deep, slow, rhythmic respiration that carried through the night air with a clarity that told me the animal was facing me. Facing downhill, facing my tent, breathing and watching. It lasted about 10 minutes and then it moved on. The footfalls resumed heavy and slow, continuing across the slope and away to the east. The baseline sounds of the forest did not return for almost an hour. I lay in my tent and thought about what I had heard. I thought about 12 years of tracking wolves and mountain lions and black bears. I thought about the sounds that they make in the dark. I've heard all of them. I've been close to all of them. I had a mountain lion scream 30 yards from my tent and my hands didn't even shake. But now my hands were shaking. Because what I heard wasn't an animal. It wasn't behaving like an animal. An animal that stumbles across a camp at 2 in the morning either investigates it or avoids it. It approaches or it leaves. It doesn't stop at a hillside 100 yards away and stand there and breathe and watch for 10 minutes. That is not predator behavior. And that is not prey behavior. That's observation, assessment. That is something with a mind looking at a situation and deciding what to do about it. I packed out the next morning. I hiked the day and a half back to my vehicle and I drove to Darby and called Delia from my motel room. I told her what I had found, what I had experienced. I told her that whatever was in the Bitterroot drainage was large and bipedal intelligent, and it was not in any wildlife database in the country. I told her it was one of ours. Delia was quiet for a while, and then she asked me to describe the droppings again. I did, and she asked about the fibrous material. I described it as best I could. She asked if it was possible that it was synthetic. I said that I didn't know. She was quiet again. And then she told me something that made me sit down on the edge of the motel bed and stare at the wall. She said the biological enrichment study in the 70s involved the release of 7 organisms. They were engineered from a primate base. She did not say what they were engineered to do. She said that the project ran for 3 years, and at the conclusion, the recovery team went in and collected 6 organisms. And the other one was listed in the final report as uncovered and presumed dead. That forest was dense, the terrain extreme. The project director signed off on the loss. 1 organism out of 7 was an acceptable attrition rate. And that was about 50 years ago. And whatever it was that they left, it stayed and it adapted and it grew. For 50 years, it lived in one of the most remote wilderness areas in the country, and it was never found because nobody was looking and because it was smart enough not to be seen. I asked Delia what the office had planned to do. She said the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness covered over 1 million acres, and that organism had demonstrated the ability to avoid detection for half a century, and that the office didn't currently have the resources or the mandate to conduct a recovery operation in that terrain. I asked her what that meant in plain language, and she said it meant that they were going to leave it alone. And Delia told me later that the hunter, a man from Boise who had been hunting elks in the Bitterroot for 20 years, the one that had seen the anomaly through his scope, sold all of his rifles within a month of the encounter. He quit hunting entirely. He wouldn't tell his wife why, he wouldn't tell anybody why. He simply stopped going into the woods and he never went back. I understand that. I didn't see it, and I understand that. Because I heard it breathing, and what I heard was not an animal. What I heard was something that was built to be more than an animal, and that had 50 years alone in the wilderness to become whatever it was going to become, and that I didn't want to see what that is. Nobody does. That's why it's still out there. That's all I got for now. If you want to hear more of what I've been through, just let me know. Stay safe out there, everyone. And don't always trust what you're being told. People in the village have avoided that vast stretch of mangrove forest near the river for decades. I remember my father warning me never to go deeper into the forest, beyond where sunlight could barely filter through the thick canopy. I wasn't the only one. Every kid in our coastal village had heard the story countless times. An evil spirit lurking somewhere in its dark, drenched corridors of trees, waiting for a chance to lunge at anybody foolish enough to wander too close. The real danger is probably much simpler and less mythical than that to most people these days. But I'm not writing this to debunk anything or to prove anything. I am old, too old. I can already feel my mind coming apart at the seams, my body deteriorating with each passing day. I am writing this as a warning to whomever it may concern. Never dismiss the remnants of old superstition still lingering in this modern world. They exist for a reason. Some may have first formed as a deterrent against the dangers of nature, passed from generation to generation as a way of making sense of the unknown. But there are places in this world where logic does not apply. The laws of reality bend and break, toyed with on a whim by forces that defy explanation. The mangrove forest near my village might be one of those places. I was only 22 when I first set foot in its treacherous, waterlogged terrain. The last time that I trod beneath its damp, suffocating canopy a few decades ago, a boy had gone missing. It was a brutally hot day under the July sun. I was standing beside my old wooden boat, minding my own business as usual, trying to untangle a stubborn pile of fishing net. The tide had gone out hours earlier, leaving the boat half buried in mud and sand. Out in the distance, the great waves of the ocean rolled endlessly toward the shore. From where I stood, they looked like long rows of dark beasts rising and collapsing over and over again. Their white crests flashed under the harsh sunlight. The air smelled strongly of salt. And then I noticed Narina standing behind me, and I swear she hadn't been there a moment earlier. "Araya," she gasped, collapsing at my feet before I could react. Her body shook uncontrollably as she tried to steady herself. The hem of her light blue dress was soaked through, heavy with dark mud and clinging sand. "What is it?" I asked. My voice was calm, more out of habit and exhaustion than kindness. Even back then, I already felt stinking old and worn out. Life had taught me long ago that panic rarely solved anything. "Rhea, he went." The rest of her words were drowned out by sobs. "Hey, slow down, take a breath." "Rhea, the mangrove forest after school." The words spilled out between sharp, frantic breaths. She pressed a trembling hand against her chest, struggling for air. "Hasn't come home." I reached down and took her shaking hands, pulling her gently but firmly back to her feet. She felt almost weightless, as if fear had hollowed her out. "Did he sneak off to fish again? That stubborn little son of a gun," I muttered through clenched teeth as we hurried toward the village, our steps quick and uneven. "Please," she sobbed, her shoulders shaking violently as she tried to keep up with me. "Find him, please." I sat her down on the rickety chair in my front porch. The wood creaked as she shifted to look up at me, her eyes glassy and unfocused. Long strands of her dark hair had come loose and stuck to her wet cheeks and neck. Looking at her like that, I remembered the day she and her son first came into my life. I had been living on my own for years, minding my own business, before Narina arrived in the village with their small son in tow. She introduced herself to me privately as my late wife's distant relative. Her story was simple and heartbreaking. She had been forced into an arranged marriage, and after years of that she had made the difficult decision to leave, taking her 2-year-old son with her. That was how she had ended up here. To avoid the gossip and drama that the village could barely contain, I introduced her as my own distant and much younger relative from my mother's side, someone that I barely knew. And just like that, the villagers had welcomed her and Rhea as if they had always been one of us. Over the years, she had proved to be a quiet, dependable presence. She helped around the house, managed things while I was out fishing, and she was an excellent cook. In return, sending her son to school seemed more than enough for a woman in a small coastal village to hope for. In the first few months, there were nights that she would linger at my doorway after Rhea had gone to bed, watching me sleep with an expectant look that I understood perfectly. I was no fool, old perhaps and less educated than her, but not blind to meaning when it stood right in front of me. I expected nothing at all, and I made that clear. I was simply grateful not to face the rest of my days alone, miserable and unnoticed. I had someone to care for now, and that was enough. "Please," she had pleaded again, her fingers tightening around my hands. I stayed with her for a while, long enough to calm her shaking breaths, speaking in low, steady tones until her panic dulled to something quieter and more manageable. "I'll find him and bring him back," I told her. From the pained look on her face, I knew she understood what that might mean. She nodded, gripping my hand so tightly that it almost hurt. "I've told you so many times," I went on. "That forest near the river is dangerous. People have disappeared there. Some of them were never seen again. No one in their right mind goes anywhere near it." She nodded again silently, tears rolling down her sunburnt cheeks. But I wasn't done. "You need to teach that boy to listen," I said. "If you tell him to stay away from a place, he stays away. Next time he pulls something like this," I shook my head, "I'll deal with it myself." When she seemed stable enough, I took her next door and asked my neighbor and her daughter to keep her company and to not leave her alone. And then I went straight to the village head's house, where a handful of men were playing ping pong in its spacious and shady front yard. I told them what had happened and they all agreed to help search for Rhea. Among them was Hassan, a young marine science student from the city who had been staying temporarily with the village head and his family for some research project. I never bothered to learn the details. City people love their names and titles, as if the right words can make them belong anywhere. I had never liked intruders, people who knew nothing of the sea, who couldn't read the wind or the water, and yet act as if they understood the place after just a few weeks of observation and note-taking. They disrupted the village's quiet, deliberate rhythm, a rhythm shaped over generations by tides, storms, and loss. To me, they were a constant irritation, a foreign weight pressing against something long and settled. And this one in particular, broad-shouldered and loud, with his sharp city accent and careless confidence, embodied everything that I despised. He had a crude, vulgar sense of humor, and he seemed determined to share it with the entire world. Whenever he opened his mouth, it was usually to mock something or someone. Most people take time to understand. It takes patience to really see who somebody is beneath the surface. But he was an exception. He wore his irritating personality openly, almost proudly. Within a few days, it was obvious what kind of man he was. He ticked every box for an obnoxious schmuck. For reasons I never quite understood, the village youths adored him. They treated him like some sort of older brother, trailing after him through the village like a pack of eager puppies. It didn't take long before his city slang started creeping into their speech. Soon they were all imitating his cool accent. Still, beggars can't be choosers, and we had a child to find. The villagers knew better than to wander too deep into the mangrove forest along the western coast. Nobody crossed the river without a good reason, and no one ever ventured into the unexplored stretches beyond it. Saltwater crocodiles were no myth, Sightings had grown rare, but every few years one turned up again, basking on the riverbank or drifting silently toward the open sea in search of prey. If that's what we were dealing with, then I needed every able-bodied man that I could get, the city oaf included. Word spread quickly through the village that a boy had gone missing. Before long, people were crowding into the front yard, some eager to help, others just there to feed their appetite for a bit of village drama. As we left the outskirts of the village and slipped into the mangrove forest, the air thickened almost immediately, damp and heavy against my skin. The salty breeze from the open sea faded behind us, replaced by the stagnant smell of brackish water and rotting leaves. The ground beneath our feet grew softer with every step, dark mud sucking at our shoes and releasing with a wet, reluctant sound. The thin mangrove roots pushed up from the earth everywhere, sharp and crooked like hundreds of black spikes, forcing us to watch every step that we took. The air buzzed with insects. Mosquitoes whined near our ears, and somewhere deeper in the swamp, a chorus of unseen creatures chirped and rasped in the shadows. Every now and then, something splashed quietly in one of the narrow tidal channels winding through the mangroves, sending small ripples through the dark water. It was the kind of place where sound carried strangely. A snapped twig or shifting branch seemed to echo farther than it should have. And after only a few minutes inside, the village already felt very far away. With every step, a dull ache began to bloom in my feet. The soles of my old shoes were worn nearly smooth, scuffed and split from years of crab hunting along the eastern coast, where a long, narrow bite cut into the land and curled inland. It had always been the safer place to glean, sheltered from the worst of the tides and sudden swells, but still the miles had taken their toll. The leather bit into my heels and I felt every stone and crooked root beneath my feet. I could really have used a new pair. My poor old feet had carried me further than I had ever given them credit for. Hassan suddenly fell into step beside me, his massive shoes nearly stepping on my old, bony feet. I winced away at once, trying to put distance between us, but he stayed close, crowding my stride. The moment that he opened his mouth, I was reminded exactly why I disliked him. "That daughter of yours, sir," he said with a grin that made my skin crawl, a lit cigarette dangling from the corner of his mouth. I didn't answer. I kept my eyes fixed on the narrow path ahead, carefully picking my way between the mangrove roots and pretending that he hadn't spoken. It was still early afternoon and the sun hung high above the forest, but beneath the tangled canopy of branches and leaves, very little of that warmth reached us. The light filtered down in thin, broken shafts that barely touched the muddy ground. The deeper that we went, the deeper it grew, and strangely enough, the air began to feel colder. "She's kinda hot," he went on, flashing a set of crooked, nicotine-stained teeth. I looked at him, blinking once and then again. It took every bit of restraint I had to not drive my fingers into his small, beady eyes right then and there. "Hot," I repeated, my voice flat with disgust. Never in my life had I heard someone reduce another human being to such a small, contemptuous word. Hot. That was all she was to him. "Oh, that's what we call pretty girls back in the city," he said with a chuckle, flicking his cigarette into the mud. "You think a widowed woman like her would ever go for a younger guy? Someone like me?" For a moment, I couldn't even form a reply. My thoughts tangled, my jaw tightened as I struggled to decide which response wouldn't end with blood on my hands. "Well," he giggled, pleased with himself. "Maybe if I managed to find her son alive." He strode past me, his boots crunching loudly through wet leaves, leaving me behind in the thickening shadows, seething, unsettled, muttering curses under my breath. Our group numbered around 20 men, most of them like fishermen myself. They knew this coastline well enough, but none of them were familiar with the stretch of forest that lay beyond the river miles ahead, or what might be waiting there. Like everybody else in the village, we had grown up hearing the same warnings about crossing the edge of the mangroves. It showed on their faces. More than a few looked tense and wary as we set out. An hour passed. The forest grew thicker and dimmer as we pushed deeper inside. The trees loomed taller around us, their trunks twisted and swollen, their roots tangled together in knotted masses that rose from the mud like clusters of dark, knobbly bones. Every step had to be placed carefully. We tried to stay close together, but the terrain made it difficult. Mangrove roots jutted out everywhere, and narrow channels of black water forced us to weave and circle around them. Before long, keeping everybody within sight of one another became nearly impossible. To my irritation, Hassan and two of the village boys who followed him around like eager puppies began shoving each other into the mud as a joke, laughing as if we were on some kind of picnic instead of a search for a missing child. For a moment, I considered telling them off and sending them back to the village. But the moment that we waded across a shallow, brackish pool and stepped deeper into the forest, my anger ebbed and was replaced by something older and far heavier. I had not set foot near this forest in years until that day. I had never needed to. It had always been a place best left alone, a boundary rather than a destination. Life had given me no reason to return, at least not until then. Not until a boy had gone missing. A boy whose mother, with a strange mix of reverence and familiarity, had taught him to call me Grandpa. My thoughts involuntarily slipped back nearly 60 years. I had only just begun to doze off when a sharp cry rang out from the thickets of tall grass in front of me. I gasped, eyes wide, struggling to grasp what was happening. But before my thoughts could gather, several things had happened at once. A brutal, swift kick landed on the back of my neck, wrenching a strangled yelp from me like a stray dog, followed immediately by the rapid stutter of gunfire crackling through the darkness, shattering the quiet night. A soldier, as Sato, barked at me, and then raised his boot to strike again. This time he missed, the toe of his shoe slamming into the ground instead, kicking up a spray of wet sand and muck that splattered across my face. Before I could scramble out of reach, he had seized a fistful of my hair and began dragging me along the muddy riverbank. I didn't understand the words that he hurled at me, but I understood the cruelty well enough. I dared not even groan. I simply stumbled along, hunched and silent. He growled in a low voice while 4 other soldiers crept behind us, careful not to make a sound that might betray their presence. We marched on, unsure which way to go. A small lantern glowing dimly in the darkness was our only source of light. The weak flame flickered with every step, throwing long, crooked shadows across the tangled roots around us. As Sato raised the lantern above his head for a moment, slowly turning in place as he studied the darkness, as if trying to find a path hidden somewhere beyond the reach of the light. And then he moved around the knobby trunk of a massive mangrove tree. The rest of us followed. I drew a quiet breath, wondering whether I would make it out of the jungle alive and what might await me if I did. Would they let me go? Or would I share the fate of my cousin whom these very men had beheaded weeks earlier? The sound of Sato's long and gleaming sword cutting through his neck beneath the low rustle of wind moving through the tall grass would ring in my ears and haunt my dreams forever. My bare feet grew numb as we continued through the swamp's cold, wet soil, my joints aching from the ocean wind whispering through the mangrove trees. They had taken my shoes from me. Running would have been futile anyway in the treacherous, uneven terrain, where every step demanded caution. And barefoot, I had been forced onto the sharp shells and jagged barnacles hidden along the ground, their edges slicing into my soles until warm blood slicked the mud beneath my feet. I thought of my parents and siblings. Dad, murdered years ago. That was when I had lost all the desire to live. I mean, what was the point? The wound in my soul had never stopped bleeding, the pain a constant companion. The sooner it ended, the better, or so I had thought. But that night, as I crept beneath the dense canopy with my captors, something unexpected stirred inside me. However broken I may have been since losing my family, my primitive instinct for survival was not completely lost. A quiet urge, born not from peace but from pain, whispered from the depths of my battered body. A renewed desire to live. I realized that I desperately wanted to feel the touch of the morning sun and the sea breeze again. As Sato whispered to the broad-shouldered man beside him, Kimura. Even in the faint glow of Sato's lantern, I noticed something different in their faces. Gone was their swagger, and in its place, tension, fear. I took some small satisfaction in that. The sounds of the swamp, the night birds, insects, croaking frogs, they chanted around us as we pressed on through darkness in search of a way out that never seemed to appear. After nearly 3 hours of slogging, my legs were almost numb when Sato finally called a rest. He dropped against the thick roots of a mangrove tree, his pale face lit by the dull yellow lantern. His rifle rested across his chest. He cast me a disgusted glance and muttered a string of curses and warnings under his breath. My heart thudded as I looked at him, sweaty, tired, half asleep. I hated this man with everything that I had. I understood then that escape was no longer an option. He was not bluffing. Kimura said something quietly to him, and Sato gave a half-hearted grunt, already closing his eyes. The other man had settled into uneasy rest. "Don't even think about escaping," Kimura said, switching to my native language, his rifle aimed into the dark behind Sato's sleeping form. "If you do, I might still show mercy and grant you a quick death." He glanced at Sato. "He won't." I nodded, watching the flame flicker in Kimura's eyes. Unlike him, I don't kill because I enjoy it. He lit a cigarette, exhaling smoke through his nose and lips in thick white plumes. "Then why do it?" I asked, suddenly surprising even myself. Kimura turned his face upward, studying me. "I'm just a soldier. I follow orders, same as everybody else out here," he said, gesturing toward the forest. "In war, it's not about wanting or not wanting. It's about proving loyalty in any way required." "You don't have to kill to do that," I replied. And Kimura gave a tired smile. "Oh, some of us don't get to choose. Let me tell you something. When I first arrived in your country, I fell in love with its beauty. That's why I started learning your language, partly to advance my career, but mostly because I wanted to understand." He took a long drag, exhaled the smoke through his nose, and went on. "The deeper I delved into your customs, the more I realized war would destroy every trace of what I admired. I was a farmer from a quiet mountain range before I was conscripted and sent here. For what? To destroy. To raise everything into ash." He shook his head and crushed the last of his cigarette against a mangrove root. "Out there, anyone not on your side is the enemy. Their humanity doesn't matter. And to be honest, I'm not speaking for my comrades. Each time I've taken a life, a piece of me died with them. My empathy, my soul. Call it what you will. When this war ends, and it will, I know the ghosts will follow me until the day that I die. Kimura lit up again and offered me the cigarette. I accepted it gracefully, hoping the heat would push back against the cold settling into my bones. In the end, we're all pawns in somebody else's game, he murmured. Sacrifices must be made, not for victory but for balance. There are no winners in war, only grief. Somewhere deep in the forest, a nightbird sang a lovely bitter song. Its call echoed among the trees, bleeding into every dark corner of the night. As Sato suddenly snapped upright with his rifle aimed into the dark, Kimura lifted both hands to calm him down. They murmured quietly to each other in their native tongue, and then Sato rose and disappeared into the trees. "I need to relieve yourself," Kimura asked me. "Better do it now, we'll be moving again before daybreak." I shook my head, flicking the cigarette into a puddle of thick mud. "Are you going to kill me?" I asked quietly. Kimura studied me for a long time before answering. "I don't know. We brought you as our guide, you know this terrain. Maybe our pursuers will hesitate if they see a local among us." I nodded again, fear still anchored deep within my chest. "Oh, don't worry," he added. "If it comes to that, I'll do it myself. Like I said, quick and painless. Sato won't dare argue with me. I'll even try to convince him to let you live. You're young, you got a future ahead of you. I don't want to rob you from that." I frowned, unsure of whether to feel grateful or afraid. Kimura opened his mouth to wake his men, but a sudden scream, sharp and shrill, tore through the forest, from the direction that Sato had gone. I flinched back until my spine struck a tree. The other men jolted awake and leapt to their feet, aiming their rifles toward the sound. Kimura snatched up the lantern and crept forward, gripping his rifle tightly. We followed, trembling from head to toe. Had the enemies caught up already? Impossible. We had traveled miles, trudging through mangrove swamps and saltwater marshes to avoid capture. There was no way they could have found us here. When we reached the edge of a murky pool, Kimura halted. The lantern cast a sickly glow across the water, where large bubbles now broke the surface in slow, gurgling bursts. But there was no sign of Sato. We all stood frozen, paralyzed in horror, and then a splash. A long, jagged tail cut the surface, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root and landing hard in the mud. My blood ran cold. We hadn't seen it. In the dim light, we couldn't have, but now it was too late. "Swamp crocodile," I whispered. "We've wandered into their territory." A second crocodile emerged silently from the underbrush. Without warning, it had lunged at the nearest man, clamping its massive jaws around his midsection and dragging him into the swamp. His scream tore into the night. Kimura's lantern hit the ground and rolled into a puddle. Darkness swallowed us. I stared at the rippling water. I had heard tales as a child, villagers vanishing while searching for crabs and never to be seen again. I had dismissed them then, believing they were nothing more than cautionary tales to scare children. But now I knew better. Kimura shouted, switching back to his own language, no longer caring who might hear. We fled blindly, stumbling through mud and over roots as more splashes echoed from all directions. Panic had turned to pure instinct, but we kept running. "How much farther to the hills?" Kimura asked between breaths as he passed me and took the lead. "Not far, just a few more kilometers along the coast." He spat in frustration and whispered urgently over his shoulder to his remaining men. They looked pale and shaken. I didn't need to understand their language to see the fear in their eyes. "Dawn's coming. Once it's light out, they'll spot us easily and get us out of here, and maybe, just maybe, we'll let you live," Kimura said. I nodded and quickened my pace. For nearly an hour, we pressed forward through the clinging mangroves. Somewhere in the darkness, the crocodile still lurked, hungry and alert. Time was running out. The end of this flight would either bring life or death. My feet had gone numb from the cold and the pain. Each step felt dull and distant, as though they no longer quite belonged to me. A thirst clawed at my throat and hunger gnawed relentlessly at the pit of my stomach. My body felt as though it had been pushed far beyond its limits, stretched thin by exhaustion and stubborn will. Still, I did not stop. This march could not go on forever. Even the longest and most desperate retreat had to end somewhere. Where this one would lead me, I tried not to imagine. The silence around us grew heavy as we moved through the darkness, pressing in from every side like a weight on the chest. Now and then it was broken by the low, restless murmurs of my captors. Uneasy whispers carried between them in the dark. Their voices were tense, edged with a nervousness they tried and failed to hide. Even they could feel it. Something about the forest was wrong. Finally, we had reached the river mouth. The open sea stretched before us, waves breaking gently beneath the hum of nocturnal insects. The salty air hung thick. "Where's the bridge?" Chimera asked. I stared him in the eye as I answered. "There is no bridge." "What do you mean?" he snapped. "You asked me to guide you through territory that the white soldiers never patrol. This part of the jungle has never been charted, not even by my people. There is no bridge. We have to cross the river." He approached the riverbank with caution. The river wasn't wide, maybe 50 meters across, but it was deep, dark, and silent. "No bridge?" he asked again, almost to himself. I stepped into the water, the soft splash echoing faintly in the dark. "Move slowly, don't splash. They sense movement." Chimera turned to his men, nodded, and followed. Their feet sank into the knee-deep silt, water whispering cold around them. The sky was paling. Morning was near. "Pelen, Pelen," I repeated, quieter this time. "Nanti dia Dengar." "Dia?" Chimera asked, confused by my words. I turned, pressing a finger to my lips. "Shh, quiet. Why are you calling it Dia?" His voice quivered. "Isn't that word used only for Pio?" Chimera never finished. A shriek shattered the silence. Behind him, a pair of thin and long green hands suddenly burst from the river and yanked one of his men under. Screaming erupted. We thrashed toward the opposite bank, desperate and terrified. But another flash, another pair of claws, and the river had claimed its second victim. Now, only us two remained. We swam, arms burning, legs heavy. Chimera's rifle vanished beneath the surface, lost forever. He didn't care. All he wanted was to reach solid ground. I reached the far bank first, grabbing a thick root and pulling myself up with surprising ease. Chimera was just behind me, but he struggled, weighed down by his muscular frame. "Help me," he gasped, clawing at the riverbank. I reached down instinctively, grabbing his arm, but then I paused. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I saw the truth in his face. The soldier who had shown me kindness, who had spoken of his home, his sorrow, his soul. He wasn't a monster. He was a man just like me, a victim of the same cruel war. "Please," he begged. I hesitated, and then I let go. "Quick and painless," I murmured. He splashed back into the river and the water erupted. Two scaled arms wrapped around him like a lover's embrace and dragged him into the deep. He didn't scream. A pair of yellow eyes glowed beneath the surface, locking onto me before vanishing. And then silence. I sat still for a long time staring into the river, listening to the distant rumble of the ocean. I knew now what the elders of the village had feared for generations. It wasn't the crocodiles, it was something worse, something ancient, something that understood. If it wanted to taste sweet, tender human flesh again, it had to let me live. When the sun finally rose and bathed the swamp in light, I stepped back into the river to begin the long journey home. I stood at the grassy edge of the river, staring down into the still, murky water, waiting in silence. Far off, the low roar of waves crashing at the river mouth drifted through the air, a reminder that high tide was on its way. Soon the water would rise and swallow the banks, creeping inward until the forest surrendered to it once more. The sooner this place was left alone, the better. Still, I did not move an inch. I kept my eyes fixed on the surface, unblinking. A smaller hand suddenly broke through the surface of the water, pale and trembling, fingers stiff with cold. For a brief, terrible moment it faltered, as if about to sink back beneath the surface. I lunged forward, grabbed hold, and hauled the rest of his body out of the river and into my arms. The boy erupted into violent gasps the moment that he's free, his chest hitching as he sucked in air, coughing and retching, water pouring from him and soaking my clothes. "Grandpa!" He cried weakly, salt water spilling from his nose and mouth as his body shook. "Easy," I murmured, holding him close and patting his back as he bent forward and emptied his stomach onto the grass. "Easy, boy." Any anger that I might once have felt over his disobedience had long since drained away, leaving only relief and a deep, settling exhaustion. After a few more minutes of gagging, crying, and shuddering breaths, his breathing finally steadied. I lifted his fragile body into my arms and began walking back toward the village. It took me hours to make my way back through the forest alone in the darkness, carrying the boy in my arms. He was soaked through and trembling, his small body pressed tightly against my chest as I struggled to find a path through the treacherous mangroves. When I finally stumbled out from the tree line, the familiar scent of salt drifting in from the ocean greeted me like a long-awaited relief. People were already gathered on the porch of the village head's house. The moment Narina saw her son curled against my chest, she let out a sound so raw that it barely resembled a scream. She ran toward us, sobbing. "He's fine," I shouted over her cries. "He's fine. I told you that I'd bring him back." She collapsed to her knees in the damp earth and tore him from my arms, pulling him into a fierce and desperate embrace. Her tears carved clean tracks through the grime on his cheeks as she pressed her face into the crook of his neck, breathing him in, as though scent alone might convince her heart that he was truly alive. The village, once buzzing with tense whispers and anxious murmurs, it fell into a respectful hush. Only Narina's broken rhythmic sobbing remained. I noticed the expressions of the men who had accompanied me into the forest earlier, relief tangled with guilt in their eyes. They must have returned before sunset. Nobody wanted to stay in there after dark, and I couldn't blame them. The village head approached me, worry still etched deep into his face. "I know you must be exhausted," he began, "but have you seen?" I shook my head firmly. He stopped mid-sentence, still looking unsure before giving a quiet nod. I knelt beside Narina and rested a hand on her trembling shoulder. Her hands moved frantically over her son, checking his arms and legs for injuries while his exhausted body clung to her, unwilling to let go. "Come," I said softly. "Let's go home. The boy's been through enough." And gently I loosened his grip on his mother and lifted him back into my arms. He did not resist. My feet still ached with every step, but the pain no longer mattered. Soon enough, they would not ache at all. Not in my new pair of shoes.